Welcome back to the channel. This is Trinity Storm and you are watching second part of What If Kid Naruto Left the Village with Itachi. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
About an hour had passed since the sun had set, and the hearth's fire was beginning to fade. In order to refuel the fire, Naruto ventured through the darkness to the woodshed located a short distance into the forest at the rear of the house. The door's hinges were long past time for an oiling, and it creaked open unsteadily. A gentle yellow glow filled the room as Naruto flipped the little switch by the door. Perhaps only 9 by 9 feet, it was by no means a large shack. A wall of tools, a sizable assortment of hammers, wrenches, and screwdrivers shining in the light, was jammed into the left side. In the middle was a small work table, its surface adorned with a variety of wood slates. The small room smelled musky due to the fine sawdust covering the floor. And a tall stack of ready.to.use, pre-cut logs was neatly stacked on the right. A voice behind him stopped the blonde in his tracks as he approached and was ready to grab a few off the top. Naruto. The voice was familiar, and he spun around, with his coal black eyes hard. He saw Itachi, the outlaw, leaning against the creaking doorframe. Naruto lowered his voice and bowed respectfully. In response, he muttered, "Master Itachi." With a simple nod, the man straightened up and approached the teenager, who was standing there staring at him intently. "Is there something you need?" For the first time in 100 years, Itachi had not expected this response. He lashed out, his hand a blur, his charcoal eyes flashing dangerously. There wasn't even enough time for Naruto to consider what was happening, let alone react. The side of his head, just above the temple, was cut by Itachi's fist. The blonde was sent sprawling to the ground, his body slamming into the wall as the seemingly insignificant blow struck his skull. He felt sick as his vision swam, all the images moving and blurry. He attempted to stand up, but when he put weight on his arms, they simply buckled and were unable to hold anything. In Naruto's ears, Itachi's footsteps sounded like explosions as he approached. He looked up, trying to clear his vision with frequent blinks. Itachi said in a low voice, with absolutely no warmth or kindness, "Do you have an explanation?" Naruto could only watch in bewilderment. He asked, "About what?" In response. This did not improve the situation. His feet were only a few inches off the ground when the Uchiha suddenly appeared beside him, grabbed his collar, and pulled him up. The teen's head struck a hammer head as he slammed him against the wooden wall once more. The rogue raised his voice to the point where Naruto started to worry that someone in the house had overheard him. "You know what? I saw you in the woods, talking to your teammate about how you want to trust them, and I know that you've been bonding with my little brother and your sensei. You were specifically prohibited to interact with them in any way," he yelled. Stuttering in defense, Naruto said, Master, you don't understand. I was merely wanting them to trust me, then maybe they would give away some information that would be useful to your plans." He was pushed harder against the rigid board by Itachi, who tightened his grip and clenched his jaw. Naruto's throat began to tighten, making it more difficult for him to breathe. Naruto's breath caught in his lungs as the man said, "Wasn't that your idea when you first came to that wretched village as well? And I had specifically told you no?" The Uchiha frowned even more, his face growing angrier by the second. For the first time in a long time, the blonde actually started to get really scared. He had witnessed Itachi get angry before, and to say that he was the cause made him realize that if he didn't resolve this, he would die. He said in a low, threatening voice, but Itachi beat him to the chase, interrupting him before he could even get a word in. "I have a meeting to get to by nightfall, so I'll make this quick. You stay away from those Konoha shinobi. I don't care if they are your team, roommates, sparring partners, what the hell ever. But, if I ever see or hear you getting close to those pathetic excuses for human beings, the consequences will be much, much greater." Itachi sighed and narrowed his eyes. With his face lowered toward the floor, Naruto gave a solemn nod. "I will have eyes keeping an eye on you the next few days. Don't make a mistake, I will hear about it." The Uchiha continued. He was momentarily distracted by the sound of leaves crackling beneath his feet, and he could hear someone approaching the shed. Then he leaned in close, his eyes dull, his face squarely in front of Naruto's. "Betrayal this far down the line is unacceptable. If I have to cut you down to get to my goal, I will," Itachi stated. He spun around and hurled the 13-year-old across the narrow room, where he fell to the ground in a tangled heap. He squatted close to the ground and then disappeared with a single leap. Sakura, Tsunami still had to boil a pan of rice to accompany the fried cod, and the water had been running low. The Junin was buried in his book when she first asked Kakashi to do it. So Sakura ended up carrying a wooden bucket and walking to the backyard well. The empty pail sashayed in the wind as she descended the stairs. As she fastened the rope handle to the shiny metal hook on the pulley system, she muttered to herself, "Freaking lazy sensei, can't even get up to get a thing of water, does he ever do anything besides read that book?" Silently, the container vanished into the blackness as she began to turn the small hand. Hold on the side. She knew right away that the bucket had hit water when she heard a splash a few seconds later. The weight in her hand tripled as she began to twist in the opposite direction, the water's force making a noticeable difference. She carefully placed it on the grass after heaving it up and out when the hook came back to the light that was spilling from the twilight. A loud crash reverberated across the clearing as she was about to return to the house. With a kunai in hand, she spun around, looking for the source of the noise. Perhaps only 30 meters from where she was now standing, a muffled voice drifted over on the wind from the shed on the far side. Her footsteps were quiet as she began to move over. Naruto had gone out for firewood just a minute before, the girl remembered. Whatever was going on, it was probably not good. Her ninja abilities failed her as she was getting close to the entrance, and she stepped on a rather large patch of dry leaves. If you weren't a clever shinobi, you wouldn't notice the crackling as they were crushed beneath her feet. She muttered a curse and accelerated her pace, realizing that whoever was there was already aware of her presence and that caution was no longer necessary. Just as she turned the corner, she caught a glimpse of an unidentified figure squatting on the ground and vanishing into the darkness. She gasped inwardly as she saw something else move in the encroaching darkness. Her voice was worried as she questioned, "Naruto, what happened?" The blonde's arms were trembling as he picked himself up off the ground. A tiny indent above his temple was the source of the crimson fluid leaking from the right side of his head. There were black to blue bruises on the skin around his collarbone and neck. He was covered in dust, and when he turned, she saw that he had struck something with the back of his head, causing the area to swell significantly. His head instantly flew to the back of his head as he stumbled to his knees and then to his feet. When he touched it, she heard his agonized groan, and he swayed back and forth, almost collapsing. He was caught just in time by the medic, who rushed in. When his head struck her arm and the teenager attempted to stand again, he hissed. He swayed back to his feet, Sakura staying nearby in case something happened. He kept his eyes firmly fixed on the ground and avoided looking at her. Then he muttered, "Thanks." Sakura merely nodded in response, her emerald eyes intently observing him. She could see he was shaken, almost torn, by whatever had just happened, even though he didn't say it. His legs were too weak to support him, so he staggered forward once more when he attempted to take a step. The sound of the impact was startling as he went to his knees. Sakura lowered himself and put his arm around her shoulder. She helped him stand again by heaving him up. Naruto opened his mouth to protest, but he was unaware that Itachi had mentioned sending someone to watch him. He could have called someone earlier, with his guardian still closely monitoring him. Sakura, however, cut him off. She began to move forward, insisting, "You can hardly move on your own. Just let me help you to the house." The blonde remained silent and kept his eyes on the floor, focusing on making a footing move before the other person did. Sakura scowled inwardly. This was one of the strongest genins she had ever seen, and he was depending on her to help him even walk. He must have been strong, and dangerous, whoever he had met in the shed. Home, Tsunami looked up and grinned as the door closed. With her hand flying to her mouth, she exclaimed, "Sakura, did you get, oh my god." Her smile vanished in an instant, and she nearly dropped the spoon, but she managed to catch it in time. Sakura was standing in the doorway, helping a very battered teammate who appeared to have been hauled to and from the depths of hell. The girl's eyes were serious as she started to walk once more, and Naruto responded right away, following her gait. She released him close to a table chair and explained simply, "Someone attacked him while he was out at the shed." The blonde simply sank to the floor, exhausted, without making any movement. With his eyes half open, he rested his head on top of the chair and rested his arm on the seat. Tsunami called out, "Kakashi-san," while keeping her gaze fixed on the boy on the ground. In an instant, the man appeared with a worried expression in his only visible eye. He said, "What's wrong?" Tsunami merely gave Naruto a nod, and when the Junin's gaze met his mouth dropped, but he quickly closed it again. The invincible ninja had never looked so tired out in his life. He could clearly see the finger like bruises around his neck with his raptor vision. His fair blonde hair was being matted down by the blood from a small puncture above his temple and a large gash on the back of his head that was starting to bleed as well. Sasuke now burst into the room, followed closely by Inari. He stumbled, "Sorry, We were in the front yard, Holy, as he saw his teammate lying on the ground, his eyes widening. The boy's head throbbed violently as he looked up, his vision blurry. He groaned and forced himself to stand up when he saw the sizable group of people staring at him, but it wasn't a good move. He staggered back and struck the wall. The only thing preventing him from sliding to the floor again was his hand, which he lashed out with while holding it firmly against the wall. To his surprise, Sasuke was the first to respond. His mind was spinning as he looked at Sakura. He insisted, "What happened?" "I don't know. I heard a crash when I went out to the well and then I just found him there. Someone else was with him, but he vanished before I could even get a word in." The pinkette clarified. With a nod, the Uchiha made his way to the rear entrance. The teenager said, "I'm going to search." He could still be in the area. He was about to grab the door handle when Kakashi suddenly appeared and blocked his path. "No one's going out there tonight but me. We don't know who this guy was, what he's after and how powerful he could be. No, you guys are confined to this house till morning. Understand?" Kakashi yelled with rage. Sasuke moved away from the door despite clenching his jaw and gritting his teeth. Sakura was just assisting him in sitting on the couch in the living room when he withdrew. Naruto moaned as he struck the furniture, and at that moment, his only desire was to go to sleep. The blissful darkness of slumber was threatening to seize control of his mind. To be honest, he wouldn't mind at all. The healing light began to spill over the indent on the medic's forehead, causing his hands to glow a faint green. While Inari peered around the doorway, his raven gaze glaring, Sasuke stood beside her, watching her work. They wouldn't last long, I knew. Gato must have been overpowered by one of his thugs. His team claims that he is strong, but I'm not sure what they mean because I bet he is just like all the ineffective heroes who attempted to save the town. He looked up and saw his mother when he felt a hand suddenly rest on his shoulder. She gave her son a feeble smile after forcing her anxious eyes to leave the boy in his living room. Though it sounded more like she was speaking for herself than Inari, she muttered, "It'll be okay. Kakashi-san said he's strong, very strong. Everything will be fine." With a sigh, he rolled his eyes and handed his watch back to the three shinobi. His thoughts were dark, and he laughed inwardly without humor. Their fate will be the same even though they're completely different from the others. They're unaware that they will perish here. I nearly feel sorry for them. As soon as those thoughts entered his mind, his eyes widened. His expression was one of shock as he turned to face the ground. "What's the matter with me?" Sakura kept a close eye on the hole in the back of his head as it began to close, the cells rapidly replacing themselves. She gave him a gentle smile, saying that he would be all right because the hammer's blow had fortunately not injured his head. With a heavy sigh, Naruto battled the black wave of debilitating sleepiness once more. His subconscious was urging him to surrender to the shadows and trust that everything would be fine upon his awakening. But he resisted. He pushed it back because, for whatever reason, he had a strong sense of stubbornness in his veins. And when he did, he swore he heard a low growl. Sakura leaned back, her forest green eyes content, and let out a loud exhale. "Well, that should do it. The pain won't vanish. I'm not that talented with medical jutsu yet," she clarified. Naruto gave a nod. His voice was pained as he muttered, "Yeah, I know." His head lolled to the side as he fell back. His breathing became labored with slumber. Sakura whispered, "You should try to stay awake. I don't know the chances of you slipping into a coma." The blonde merely gave a feeble shake of his head. He whispered, "Can't. Something beckoning me, must sleep." With a sigh, he drifted off into unconsciousness and sleep. His final words, however, came out of his mouth so softly that the two hardly heard him. He whispered, "I have to please him. Stay away from the team or I'll die." Sasuke and Sakura flinched, their eyes growing as big as dinner plates. They looked at each other with a knowing look that conveyed everything that needed to be said. Anyone who attacked him was known to Naruto. He had to comply with whatever was said between them. After a week, the sun was already high in the sky on this typical day in Wave Country. It was the ideal day to stay inside and ignore the burning sun outside their windows because it was so hot outside. However, it seems that shinobi don't operate that way. Kakashi said they were at a fairly good level for the time being after concluding their training session just yesterday. In 2 days, they would resume their lessons, but he believed that everyone would benefit from a pleasant respite. Regretfully, his break concept differs somewhat from the others. They were now seated on the partially finished bridge, unable to train, and forced to watch over the builders as they worked in the late morning and early afternoon. The three teenagers were sprawled in the few shadows they could find, watching with bored faces as sweaty men carried steel arms back and forth. It was already noon, and lunch was not due for another hour and a half. Sakura sighed as she leaned back against the slender metal rails, which were likely the only cold object in the area for miles. Tossing a stone up and down while lounging in a corner between two crates, Naruto managed to catch it without even looking at the pebble. Sasuke lay on the ground, just inches from the boundary between the warm, blazing sunlight and the semi-cool shadow. With his arms supporting his head and his onyx eyes scanning the horizon, he watched indifferently as the workers gradually added structure to the bridge. Overhead, a crane was dragging slowly, transporting a load of the titanium braces to the point where the crossway's jagged edge plunged into the sea. One of the thinner pieces abruptly fell off its rack, clattering to the cement floor after falling 10 feet or more. Many of the workers ignored it because they already had a heavy load on their arms. With curious eyes, Sasuke looked up at his two teammates. "You guys want to go get that?" he said, tilting his head toward the bar that was stranded not too far from where they were resting. The two shook their heads at the same time, neither intending nor desiring to leave the cool spot out of the sun's glare. With a frustrated sigh, the Uchiha leapt to his feet and walked to the arm's location. He knelt down to examine it, looking for dents and other flaws in the immaculate, smooth surface. He shrugged when he saw none, grasped it firmly, and got to his feet. Unfortunately, he didn't notice the burly man walking directly in front of him as he got back up because he hadn't stopped to look up before getting up. Additionally, he had an extra, large iron bar in his possession. When the boy with the raven hair finally moved, he dove headfirst into the bar, creating a brassy echo that echoed across the wide waterway and sounded somewhat like a coconut striking a large bell. Even though Naruto had been following instructions exactly for the previous 7 days and had been told not to show any emotion, he was unable to control himself when this incident occurred. He erupted in laughter and collapsed to the ground, gripping his sides. His eyes filled with tears, and in a matter of seconds, he was struggling to breathe and experiencing excruciating pain in his sides. Sakura laughed softly, her mood lightened by Naruto's jovial demeanor and Sasuke's accident. Over the past 2 days, the boy had been so aloof that he only spoke when it was absolutely required. He had initially been collaborating with them as a team and seemed to be enjoying it as well. However, he insisted on training alone the day after the attack in the woodshed, and he vanished into the woods before they could protest. Somewhere deep in the barricade of the tree, she had heard Kakashi and Tazuna talking about the blonde a few nights prior, when he was out for his training sessions. Some evenings before, Sakura went down the stairs in silence, looking for a glass of water. She was practicing another healing method she had read about that used just a cup of water and a small amount of chakra to heal a very deep wound. She heard her sensei's voice, in an unusually melancholy tone, as she turned the corner into the kitchen. "And I just don't understand what's come over him," he murmured. Someone sat down and sighed, and there was the screech of a chair scraping across the wooden floors. The other person's voice revealed itself to be Tazuna's. "Are you sure there's been a difference in the boy's behavior? I mean, sure, he doesn't train with the team anymore, but maybe since he's always been a loner, he might just prefer it that way." No, only days before he had been asking me to train him personally. He wanted to learn the walking on water technique, and of course I agreed. In fact, he was just starting to get the hang of it. "I just wish I knew what was going on inside that child's head," replied Kakashi. The girl could only assume that Tazuna was thinking because he didn't respond right away. With a whisper, the bridge builder inquired, "What exactly happened to him?" Kakashi let out a quiet sigh as his knuckles slid over the uneven tabletop, causing a slight scratching sound. "He disappeared mysteriously when about 7 years ago, the night of his 5th birthday. From what reports said, there had been a mob of villagers after him, their leader one of the usual people known to attack him." Kakashi started. Sakura's gaze expanded. Attacks? To make matters worse, no one had ever informed them that Naruto had been attacked by a villager. The third Hokage had always put the boy in a high place in his heart and was deeply depressed when he heard of his vanishing. At first, he was quite certain that the leader, Kwahi, had killed him. But after a stern and rough interrogation, they found it to be false. So he sent out numbers of shinobi to search for him, my Anbu team being one of them. We scoured the area as far as the Wind Country's borders, the Sound Country's main line and even the ocean shorelines. But no one found him. After a year, with a heavy heart, the old man finally had to put the case to rest, marking him as deceased. Surely a small child barely 3 feet tall could have ever survived that long. Tazuna muttered, "But you were wrong." Kakashi must have given a nod. Most began to forget he even existed by the time he returned. In fact, He only arrived in the village about a week or so before you hired us for the mission." The Hokage was thrilled, ecstatic, but he was changed. You should have seen him before, always so bouncy and full of spirit. It was hard to make that kid sit down, much less stop talking. But when he came back, he was so calm, collected, dark. Our leader, the greatest ninja in the village, was scared. The aura around him was so strong and heavy of killing intent that Anbu for miles came back from their missions, certain that Orochimaru had made a move. Sakura's eyes narrowed. Orochimaru? For some reason, she couldn't remember if she had heard about him in any of their history lectures. He demanded to be let into the graduating class, even though the final exams were the next day. The Hokage was reluctant, close to positive that the boy wouldn't even be able to comprehend what was being tested on. But we were proven wrong when he did make it, best in the class even. Sakura's mouth fell open. Top of the class. Iruka had told the class that Sasuke had won that honor, and she had always believed it. However, what if the Chunin had been concealing the startling truth that a rookie who had only joined the class the day before had overtaken the top shinobi for years? He was assigned to my team. The Hokage thought it best if I was the one to watch him. We were all pretty curious as to where the boy got his power and from whom, but back then. We thought he'd sing like a canary in no time. But this kid is so difficult to figure out. Just a few nights ago he was asking me for help on opening up, on trusting his team. He sounded like he really truly wanted to. But now, he's almost worse than before. I don't know what to do anymore. Kakashi finished his sentence in a whisper, so that Sakura was forced to listen. Walled to hear him. Tazuna let out a sigh. Well, I've never trained young shinobi and I've only known this kid for a short while. The man began. Kakashi laughed. He muttered, we're in the same boat on that one. His ring caught in his gray hair as Tazuna ran a hand through it. But my best advice for you would be to keep on it. If he's shown signs of being an actual child underneath all that withdrawal, you might be able to reach him. Try to figure out his past, there might be something hurting him. Tazuna offered. For what felt like the 100th time in the last few minutes, Kakashi let out another sigh. I know, I can just feel it. But, I don't know if it has to do with his time in the village, or something else, something that deals with whoever attacked him in the woodshed. Tazuna paused to process this information. He inquired, how do you think that? Sasuke told me what Naruto had mumbled in his unconsciousness. Must please him, stay away from team, or I'll die. There has to be some connection with the person and his attacker. Otherwise he never would have let that portion of valuable information slide. Besides, who else would be him? Why would any of us tell him to stay away from his team or he'll die? Kakashi said. Tazuna agreed with a grunt. But what about the attacks? Being back in the village again, it might be opening up old wounds, he said. It might be possible. I mean, people were pretty vicious to him in the past. I'm not even sure if anything has changed. He just got back and then he left again for a mission. We haven't had time to assess the villagers' reaction. Kakashi clarified. Tazuna said in a furious tone, I don't understand why they could be like that. I mean, come on, what on earth could make them act like that? Kakashi let out a loud sigh. It isn't exactly something on earth, it's got to do with a tragedy that happened to the Leaf Village a long while ago, and they pin what happened on the poor child's shoulders, when he had nothing to do with it in truth, no choice in the matter at all. All the villagers treated him so horrible, looked down on him, and blamed him for what happened, when in reality, he had only been a baby. I'm ashamed to admit that for a few years in the beginning of his life, I agreed with them. Kakashi replied with a sad face. Tazuna asked, what great tragedy? How could this boy have anything to do with it? Sakura leaned forward, hoping for a slightly clearer sound as Kakashi cleared his throat. But she fell forward because she leaned too much and her hand slipped off the wall. Her hand flew to her mouth as she wheeled herself upright after giving a quiet yelp. When she heard Kakashi quietly rise from his chair and move to the doorway, the room had fallen silent. Just as Kakashi was about to peek around the corner where she had been standing a moment before, the pinkette quickly turned and ran up the stairs, vanishing behind the wooden walls. Whoever had just been there must have heard what they had been saying, he scowled. How long did he fear that response? Now, since then, she had been attempting to speak with the teenager in order to learn more about the boy who had been subjected to such terrible treatment. But, to put it mildly, things hadn't gone as planned. 3 days before, Sakura had spent the last 2 days looking for Naruto's hidden training location in the woods, but she had never been successful. A huge explosion shook the area as she was about to return for lunch, and she staggered into a nearby tree, clinging to the trunk for support. Perhaps a quarter of a mile from her current location, she saw a billow of smoke rise above the trees to her left. Since no one else could make Wave Country tremble in its boots, she was certain that Naruto was the blast's origin. When she arrived at the vast clearing where the bang had originated, she ran swiftly, her lungs burning frantically for oxygen. The blonde was standing with his back to her in the center of the field, as she had predicted, and she could see that he was having difficulty breathing. When Naruto turned around, his hair covered in dirt and small tufts of grass protruding in random places, she had taken a step forward but had not even left the shade of the trees. When he noticed who was standing there, his eyes darkened, and he chose to ignore her in favor of a low Chunin class taijutsu exercise that would make him appear weaker than he actually was. Sakura approached the blonde with composure as he moved fluidly through stances and movements, observing him with curiosity as he extended his arms, the forms complex and protective. She began, "Naruto, I want to ask you something." The blonde didn't even look at her, let alone answer. She inhaled deeply and then exhaled. "Naruto, what happened to you that made the villagers attack you?" She threw away. Naruto immediately halted and spun around, his blue eyes bulging with incredulity. Not believing what he had just heard from the girl's lips, he asked incredulously, "What?" She took a trembling breath and gave it another go. She asked once more, "Why do the villagers hate you, for something you couldn't control?" Naruto's eyes went black with rage as his shock turned to rage. He insisted, "Who told you?" Sakura avoided his angry stare, focusing only on the ground. He repeated, "Sakura, who told you that?" But his tone was no longer angry. She was shocked to see the tiniest trace of tears close to the corners of his eyes when she looked up. However, he blinked back the intense emotion that briefly overcame him as soon as she believed she had seen them. "It's just, Naruto, I want to know. If something's hurt my friends, I want to help," Sakura said quietly. Naruto turned away, his face unreadable and relaxed, if only a little. "Sakura, I'm warning you now. Before you get too deep, leave it alone." Now, he hadn't spoken to her since, well, he hadn't spoken at all for a long time. This was the first time he had demonstrated anything other than walking around that he was still alive. As he walked back to his friends, Sasuke rubbed the top of his head and growled. He leaned back into the shadows and supported the bar against a big wooden crate. He muttered angrily, "This is why I don't help people." After pushing himself back up, Naruto inhaled deeply. Sakura's eyes happened to meet his, and he saw that she was grinning broadly as she looked at him. The laughs that had racked his body just seconds earlier were gone, and his smile instantly disappeared, leaving him expressionless as usual. Sakura took one step forward and 3 steps back, letting out an inward sigh. Later, he was dying over this. It would have taken a truckload of salt to make the rest of the afternoon even remotely interesting, aside from the whole Sasuke hitting his head thing. He was on the verge of falling asleep when he noticed a sparkle in the water below. It was a sword hilt, since it wasn't a fish. He leaned over the railing and looked down. Out of the vast expanse of glassy water, a familiar face grinned, and his brow furrowed. With a start, he sprang to his feet and leapt onto the steel railing. Sasuke and Sakura looked up curiously. He flipped over the hand bar after saying, "I'll be right back, don't bother following me." Sasuke turned to face the pinkette, who continued to gaze at the spot where the blonde had been standing. He questioned, "Should we go after him?" Sakura let out a sigh. "If he's not back in 3 minutes, we'll follow him." Beneath the bridge, grabbing a pipe on the bridge's underside, Naruto swung onto a concrete platform directly beneath the massive brick structure that supported the enormous walkway above him. Watching the black waters lap at the side of the stone ledge, he stood close to the edge. The person he had seen emerged from the water shortly after, his hair plastered to his face and his robe drenched. Naruto questioned, "Shouldn't you find a better way for transportation?" Kisame gave a shrug. The shark man answered, "What better way than the natural way?" A tiny stream of water poured out of his ear as he shook and cocked his head to the side. "I have some good news, but first, I saw that little burst of laughter when Sasuke smashed into the steel arm." Kisame replied with a stern expression. Naruto froze, realizing that he was now screwed. "Well, how can you not laugh? It was freaking hilarious. I mean, a week of not speaking is pretty good and makes up for the laugh, doesn't it?" Naruto responded with a defense. With a toothy grin, Kisame raised his hands. Whoa, calm down. I was laughing my ass off too. I get where you're coming at. Itachi won't hear about it, I swear." The Akatsuki laughed. Naruto grinned. Ever since he first met Kisame, he had liked him. He and Kisame used to play prank after prank on the others when he was a child and hiding out in the base while Itachi was away. Naturally, individuals like Deidara, Sasori, and Conan would typically take the brunt of the punishment directed at the fish-man. When the three of them gathered around the little tyke, torturing him with wet willies and other things, he would always be laughing loudly. Naruto's smile softened. Before all of this spy stuff, those had been the good times. Everything was so confusing now. Well, anyways, the reason I'm here is to tell you you're off the hook, Kisame replied. Naruto's eyebrow went up. Itachi feels that after all the progress I've reported, you're trustworthy enough to stay here on your own without a supervisor, he concluded. Inside, Naruto cheered. At last, he could stop pretending to be the awkward fish when he stumbled in the woods and had to tell Kakashi that he had nearly run into a tree. Roughly 3 times between the house and the forest clearing where the team practiced every day. I have been ordered to return to the hideout today, so I will be leaving as soon as I finish here. Now, he expects you to remain the same the rest of your time here, even though no one will be keeping tabs on you until the day of Itachi's plan is finally carried out. With his heart pounding at the thought that Itachi's secret plan might be implemented the day he returned from this mission, Naruto questioned, how will I know what to do, when to do it, how to do it? Well, he said that he'd contact you precisely 3 days before the Chunin exams back home. Then he will tell you all you'll need to know. He hasn't told me any more than that. Well, regarding your job, Kisame replied with a grin. Despite rolling his eyes, Naruto grinned. He crossed his arms and answered, whatever fish. Face. With an even more outrageous mess than usual, Kisame ruffled the blonde's hair while grinning. Kisame said softly as he stepped back out onto the water and slowly sank in, see ya in a while shorty. Naruto's eyes flashed, but not in a dangerous way. Defending himself, he said, I'm growing you know. Kisame gave a snort. His head vanished into the clear liquid and vanished into the darkness as he sarcastically replied, I'm sure. On the bridge, with a glance at his pink friend, Sasuke said, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Let's go get him. With a sigh, Sakura got to her feet, holding onto the rail for balance. You're right, well, let's get. Just as she was finishing her sentence, the boy they were referring to leapt over the edge, landing silently on his feet with his face hidden. Sakura and Sasuke gave him curious looks, but he remained silent. He whispered, I thought I saw something, false alarm. Sasuke grinned. Seeing things are we? Inquired the Uchiha. However, the boy didn't even look at him, let alone respond. He had returned to his typical self, which was not at all a good thing. Later that evening, finally coming back from his self-training session, Naruto slipped through the back door and headed for the stairs. However, the person who had grown interested in him, and his previous life, intercepted him at that point. Sakura pointed to the living room and said, Can I talk to you? After giving this some thought, Naruto realized that she would most likely deny him sleep tonight unless he responded to a few questions. Pinching the bridge of his nose, he closed his eyes and let out a breath. At last, he said, Fine, but I have the option to decline questions I don't want to answer. Sakura grinned. Perhaps she would succeed. Sakura pulled her feet up under her, sat Indian style, and faced the blonde with her eyes shining while Naruto leaned against the sidearm of the couch. She began by asking, Where have you been the past 7 years? Naruto winced. Excellent, let's go. Sakura sighed, but she was adamant, so she gave it another go. Pass. Who trained you? Pass. What brought you back? Pass. What originally prompted you to flee? Pass. Sakura blew a lock of hair out of her face and let out an exasperated sigh. Will you respond to my questions? Naruto shrugged in response to her question. He said, I told you I'd only answer what I wanted to. Sakura let out a loud sigh. The girl narrowed her eyes and said, All right, I'll try something simple. What's your favorite color? Sakura scowled, but it vanished in a flash as Naruto sighed and shot back a tiny smirk. Pass. He muttered, Orange. Sakura arched an eyebrow and gave him a quick glance. She got another little smile from the blonde and said, Oh yeah, I can totally see that. Black is a concealing color. Sakura nodded as he continued, It makes it easier to blend with the shadows and it gives you a more threatening appearance. I think the first time we saw you, a couple of the kids were about to piss their pants. Naruto grinned. Sakura cocked her head and he replied, Good, I like it that way. But I can tell you're not like that. Naruto scowled as she remarked, You're much different than what you want people to believe. The boy turned his head and muttered, You don't understand just exactly how far you are from the truth. Sakura frowned. Sakura said simply and quietly, There are times when I can read you like a book, when your outer demeanor crumbles. The blonde sighed and got up, making his way to the stairs, placing a hand on the rail but looking back before turning in for the night. You say you can read me like a book, but these pages are torn and frayed. Then he vanished, leaving a girl even more perplexed to ponder. After 2 days, Naruto, who had been training hard the previous night and had even passed out on the forest floor, rushed down the stairs to catch up with his team for the first time in his life. However, someone, had woken him up at dawn. Rewind. His overworked and aching senses were awakened instantly by the sound of soft footsteps approaching him. Naruto's cerulean eyes opened and he moaned softly, his hands burning as if they had been dipped in boiling water, held over a blazing fire, and struck by flares. An overload of chakras had rendered him unconscious. My head UGHS from stupid explosive jutsu. Despite feeling sick, Naruto managed to pull himself into a sitting position. It required a lot of focus to avoid blacking out once more. Are you okay? A small, quiet voice asked. Naruto quickly turned, his side rippling with a new kind of pain, gritting his teeth against the wave of agony, and his eyes met curious chocolate ones as he quickly assessed the girl in front of him. Her skin was pale but tinted pink from exposure to the sun, and she wore a pink kimono with light red sides and strange black swirls, if you can call them that, all over the garment. Her hair was deep ebony and fell easily to her shoulder. Blades in a long waterfall of strands. The blonde saw that she was carrying a small basket, expertly woven from fine strands of bamboo, which was holding a rather large pile of various herbs. You'll catch a cold if you continue to sleep out here, she added, approaching. You shouldn't go into the woods by yourself and confront foreign shinobi. What if I had launched an unexpected attack? Without bothering to respond to the girl's question, Naruto said, you'd be dead, that's what. The girl gave him a small smile and knelt down a few feet away. Although Naruto scowled a little, she said, I could tell even from the shadows that you have a kind heart, you would not hurt me. I don't know what gave you that impression, but let me just take the liberty to tell you, you're wrong. The unidentified girl gave a headshake. Naruto sneered as she assertively stated, I can read your body language, I can understand who you really are underneath the mask. Because I've never heard that one. And they were wrong back then too. Little late on this conversation, he replied, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath while savoring the morning outside before lowering himself back onto the soft tuft of grass he had been sleeping on for the previous few hours. Do you not have a special someone in your life? Don't you want to give your life to protect something? He couldn't see that behind his closed eyes, but she watched him intently as she asked. Compassion is your worst enemy. Mercy is a weakness. The girl sighed, and the blonde teenager abruptly stood up, the motion smooth and instantaneous. A truly strong shinobi is the one that is emotionless and without something to lose. If you have a heart, you'll surely perish, Naruto muttered in a monotone, as if he had been told the same words over and over again, to the point where he now lived by them. He shoved his hands in his pockets and remarked, I better get back, we have things to do and time waits for no one. Even the most powerful people have something to care about, despite your current denials. She went on, clearly not prepared to end the conversation. The worst of all is when you don't realize it, but once you do, it's too late to save the thing that's precious to you. Naruto let out a deep, heavy breath, his sapphire eyes heavy. It was nice talking to you again, Haku. As he watched the blonde leave, Haku's eyes grew wide. How did this boy know his name? He asked, acknowledging that although the blonde's face looked familiar, he was unable to identify it. However, they must have previously met if he was aware of his true name. Naruto stepped into a shadow and said, oh, and I would stick to pants if I were you. Then he vanished in an instant. Finish the flashback. The rest of his team must have woken up shortly after his return, leaving for the bridge just minutes ago. He had returned approximately an hour and a half ago, falling back asleep the moment his head touched the pillow. He assumed they were trying to let him sleep. The young child glared up at the shinobi, but Naruto ignored it and sped toward Tsunami after he skidded into the kitchen and nearly collided with Inari, who was making her way into the living room. How long have they been gone? It took skill to get dressed, fully equipped, and ready in a matter of seconds, and air wasn't getting to his lungs very easily at the moment, so he asked, panting. She replied, only a couple of minutes ago. They wanted you to get your rest. Naruto nodded his gratitude and whirled around, passing Inari once more on his way out, while the boy with the raven hair watched him with a flaming gaze. Naruto turned back, his ocean eyes meeting angry charcoal ones. With a tinge of sarcasm in his voice, he said, try smiling once in a while, it makes the world go round. Then he stepped out the door and jerked forward, too quickly for the human eye to see. Woods. Since he was by himself, Naruto didn't have to worry about holding back, and he moved at an incredible pace, getting a quarter of the way there in a matter of seconds. Of course, he didn't go all out, but instead took some time to enjoy himself, navigating around the trees and tossing branches, and for the first time in a long time, he was having fun. A rather large boar lay dead, covered in slash marks, the grass deep crimson with its blood, and he was about to cross the halfway point when he was stopped in his tracks by an unusual sight on the forest floor. Naruto swung down to examine the carcass. It had not been killed by an animal attack, but rather by a sword cut, the scrapes narrow and deep, and there were several strewn footprints in the dirt surrounding it, circling the boar and then leading away, coming from the east and going west. Headed straight for Tsunami's residence. The thought of two extremely talented swordsmen searching for blood on their way to Tsunami's place made Naruto's heart skip a beat. They would most likely not spare the two, killing them both immediately in their pursuit of the bridge builder and ninja who were no longer even there. The blonde looked from side to side, his heart ripped, his head pounding. Can I continue? Master Itachi always advises completing the task at hand. If you let anything get in your way, you will fail. That's not right, though, I simply must return. Kakashi would want me to go save them, but I'm just using them as a disguise, and I don't have any affection for Kakashi or the team. However, if that were the case, why am I so eager to catch up with them? Why do I feel as though they are in danger and I want to be there to help them? He was aware of what Kakashi and Itachi would say, but the true question was, who should he follow? The house of Tsunami. Tsunami ran from the kitchen, wondering what Inari could have broken now, but she screamed when she saw the truth. A loud crash came from the living room. Her house had a door on the floor with its hinges ripped off, and two burly men stood with deadly looking blades at their sides, the ends of which flashed a gleaming ruby liquid. One wore a royal purple hat over his head, a baggy light lavender hoodie, and purple gray hair that reached his chin. He had small black lines that started at the bottom center of his eyes and ended at the tops of his cheekbones. The other wore no shirt, but a deep indigo tattoo swirled over his left shoulder, and he held a wriggling Inari in his hand. He had brown hair pulled up in various ponytails around his head, and a scraggly chocolate beard sprouted from the bottom of his chin. He had a scar on his forehead and a patch covering his right eye. Now let go of him. The purple-haired one grinned as she stammered. Inari looked fearfully at his mother, who nodded tremblingly and said, "Oh, we will, don't you worry about that, we just need you to come with us, and nothing will happen to the little tyke." As she approached them, she cried, "Okay, just don't hurt him." The man let go of the young boy, who fell violently to the ground, and as soon as Inari's arm slipped out of his grasp, he swung out and grabbed Tsunami's elbow, holding her hands behind her back. He growled and shoved her forward, saying, "All right, move it." They left through the ragged doorway they had made and headed toward the woods. Inari's eyes filled with tears, and he scrambled to his feet, stumbling after them. "Mom. No. I can't lose her too," he screamed, gripping the wall side for dear life. As the two men led his mother away, the young child ran out of the house, and the women turned around and yelled, "Inari, don't." The brunette looked back and laughed when he saw the boy chasing after them. As he drew his blade and charged at the kid with the raven hair, he muttered, "This will only take a second." Inari froze in place, unsure of what to do next. "That's it, I'm dead and have nothing to help me." Tsunami struggled against purple hair's hold, but he refused to move and simply grinned as his partner proceeded to murder the helpless youngster. Gato's thug approached him and swung up, ready to bring the sword down upon him. Inari closed his eyes and waited for the wave of death that was so near to him, the bite of pain, and the drip of blood. Instead, he heard the sound of metal hitting metal reverberating throughout the clearing. When Inari looked up and saw who was standing there, she flinched. The man nearly 3 times his size skidded backward a few inches as Naruto gritted his teeth and pushed hard. "How about making fun of someone who is your own size?" The swordsman laughed as Naruto whispered threateningly, his eyes stormy and dark. "Are you shorty? You're not much of an increase." He laughed. The man staggered forward, unprepared for the shock, as Naruto tightened his jaw and vanished in a streak. In a desperate attempt to find his opponent, he whirled around. "Where have you gone?" His purple-haired friend's eyes darted around in a panic, searching for the enigmatic teenager, as he muttered. The thug staggered away, dropping Tsunami in the process, and Naruto quickly picked her up before crouching and disappearing once more. Naruto suddenly materialized behind the man carrying Tsunami and delivered a blow to the middle of his back. After landing beside Inari and letting her go, the women embraced her, tears streaming down her cheeks. Inari grabbed his mother's hand back, but his gaze was fixed on Naruto, who smirked and stepped forward, revealing himself in front of the brunette. He wheeled back and punched him in the face, sending him flying. The trunk of a tree snapped like a toothpick as he crashed through it, and the massive oak fell to the ground, its roar deafening as it struck the hard, packed dirt. The man was picking himself up off the ground, coughing hard from the dust in the air, when the blonde approached him calmly with his arms folded across his chest. He looked up to see the Konoha ninja standing over him, his face smug. His partner quickly followed, making a wide circle around the boy as he yelled and stumbled to his feet, retreating into the woods. "Boo," he muttered. Naruto gave a small laugh and quickly turned back to face the two on the pier, by their side, while Tsunami grinned broadly and met his eyes with tears in them. She sobbed, "Thank you." Naruto nodded and turned, prepared to face his team and the threat he was now certain existed there, but not before saying these words to Inari. "What you did back there was very heroic and courageous," he said. "You have promise, kid. Give these people the hope they need." Inari turned to face him, his glare softening, and he smiled, weakly but surely. Naruto returned the grin and began to run, wanting more than ever to be with his team at this moment. Bridge. With kunai ready, the three shinobi formed a ring around Tazuna, their eyes searching the area, taking nothing for granted, keeping their senses open as the mist curled over the bridge, wafting across the water and obstructing the group's view of almost everything. The two genin never expected to hear the same voice again, but a deep, low laugh pierced the mist's concealment. The Mist Rouge smirked evilly at Kakashi, his hand slowly creeping to his hilt, and Zabuza appeared from the white walls, the Anbu from before on his immediate right, her mask in place. He growled, "Time to finish the job." The girl next to him pulled out 3 senbon, holding them between her fingers so they could be thrown at the people in front of her. "Haku, take the genin, Kakashi is mine." Zabuza growled, and the boy who appeared to be next to him nodded before taking a step forward toward Sakura and Sasuke. Raising his kunai, Sasuke stepped in front of Sakura and the bridge builder. Sakura nodded and remained by their client, hoping more than anything that they had waited for Naruto this morning. "I'll take him," the Uchiha muttered. With a sly grin, Zabuza quickly disappeared, leaving Kakashi to race to an unidentified place to engage the Mist Rouge in combat. Sakura took a step back as the bridge builder saw her defense solidify. On the inside, she was freaking out, but she looked back and smiled reassuringly. She said, "Just stay close. Everything will be fine." Tazuna gave a numb nod, his gaze remaining fixed on the masked boy a short distance away, his face indeterminate behind his mask. Haku mumbled, "Come at me." Sasuke Uchiha. On either side of the boy, 3 Zabuza clones appeared out of the fog as if at the same moment. He nodded his head, and they rushed toward the Uchiha, swords out, running fast. Wanting to confront them directly, Sasuke smirked and ran away. Sword and kunai were about to make contact when they vanished, retreating behind Haku. Sasuke clenched his jaw and pressed on, getting further and further away from Sakura and Tazuna. The clones launched another attack, this time staying close to Haku, as the raven-haired mist assistant stepped back. With a war cry, Sasuke swung his blade, cutting deep into one side and then spinning around to cut the other in the forehead. Unbelievably, they both collapsed to the ground, becoming nothing more than water puddles. The tiny knife flew through the place where a real man's heart would be when Sasuke swung it out. It seemed innocuous as it moved through his body. However, his shape melted and a splash of liquid fell to the ground as soon as the kunai flew through his back. Turning, Sasuke slipped into a stance, prepared to confront the Anbu with the charcoal head. Having him precisely where he wanted him, Haku grinned and lifted his left hand to form a single sign in front of his chest. He exclaimed, "Makyu Hyosho." Sasuke was frozen in place. He had never heard a jutsu like that before, and it could mean anything. Large crystal mirrors submerged in the water that splashed on the ground surrounding the two, solidifying into ice. The ice encircled them in a 360-degree circle, and they stretched higher and higher until they were 3 mirrors up and the top closed off like a dome. With a small laugh, Haku stepped back and slid effortlessly into the large, paned mirror. His image persisted, but his entire body was hidden, making it impossible to attack him from the outside. Amazingly, Sasuke had just set up his opponent's next move. He gritted his teeth. With a loud sigh, he reached into his star pouch and touched the load of shuriken he stored there. He smiled, relieved that, for once, he had packed a lot. In a smooth motion, he struck out, a few piercing stars whirling in the direction of the mirror in which Haku was purportedly imprisoned. The key word is allegedly. The boy vanished in a flash, the shuriken slamming into the smooth surface and bouncing off, landing uselessly on the ground just as the shining scraps of metal were about to make contact. Sasuke muttered out a curse. He whispered, "Great, he can move too. What else does he have over me?" A cloud of needles suddenly emerged from the mist and pierced his skin in many different locations, from his ankles to the base of his neck. He reached up, the end shining with his blood, and yanked one out with a grunt. He sighed, "I just had to ask." A woman's scream reverberated across the bridge at that precise moment. Sasuke turned abruptly, toward the direction from which the cry had originated. Sakura. Sakura. She was still feeling fairly confident even though Sasuke and Kakashi had only been gone from her side for a few minutes. Even though her knees hurt from the way she was standing, her stance hadn't changed yet. She was prepared to strike when needed, with one kunai in her hand and another at her fingertips. However, she had not anticipated being attacked simultaneously by 4 Zabuza clones. No, that was unexpected. All of a sudden, they emerged from the shadowy white, running quickly, 3 of the 4 swords out and ready. Her eyes widened and her stomach began to churn with that familiar feeling of fear. However, she gulped it down, scowled, and gripped her weapon more tightly. She was determined to play her part and wasn't going to back down. When the first one got close to her, she slipped to the ground and kicked through the clone's shins while sliding her foot clockwise. The remainder of his body exploded in a shower of water droplets as it fell to the ground. In order to strike him downward, the second one leapt into the air and swung the blade behind his head. Sakura dug her toes into the ground and blocked at the last second, throwing up the kunai. Her elbows trembled a little as the weight was pressed down on her, but she managed to hold after skidding back a few feet. She managed to push the shinobi away from her after her eyes flashed and she exerted all her strength. After exchanging glances and backing up a few steps, the 4 surviving water clones formed a tight barricade at the entrance to the large bridge, standing side by side in a line. They all yelled together as they formed a string of hand seals. 4 hideous water dragons emerged from the sea below them, and Sakura's eyes grew wide. Their eyes shone bright yellow, and when their liquid mouths opened, loud roars of ferocity echoed, making the genin wince. Their bodies entwined in a complex dance as they rushed at the 2 at a dizzying pace. Sakura realized as they got closer that she didn't have a high enough jutsu to stop them, and that a simple kunai wouldn't be enough. She gave the bridge builder a quick look before pushing him away, causing him to sprawl sideways and clutch at the air to keep from falling. Sakura waited for the bone crushing impact of thousands of gallons of rushing water on her tiny body while closing her eyes. Instead, she heard a loud crackling sound that grew from a faint, soft sound to the roar of a flaming fire. She opened her eyes, curiosity eating her from the inside out, even though common sense told her not to move a muscle as the air around him became uncomfortable hot. She hadn't noticed the name, but she was startled to see a young boy with raven hair standing in front of the flames, his hands extended, the palms smoking from whatever jutsu he had just cast. When Sakura realized how much power he had also pumped out, her eyes widened even more. There was a huge wall of crazy fire in front of him, just inches from his toes, with stray arms of the flames licking the sky before disappearing once more and retreating back into the enormous flaming barricade. Although the dragons were large enough to compete with the enormous, towering wall, it seems that they were unable to put out the fire. The raindrops that fell from the sky gave her the impression that they had collided with the blinding divider, even though she hadn't seen or heard it. As though he were as hot as his jutsu, steam rose from the teenager's shoulders. The fire smothered itself out as it collapsed with a hand wave. She looked at the bridge's floor, certain that the blazing bonfire had melted the concrete. To her surprise, however, there was absolutely no indication that a massive wall of flames had ever existed. Nothing, no ash, no scorch marks. It seemed to have vanished completely. Her gentle emerald eyes met the boy's crimson-red ones as he turned to face her. Her hand flew to her mouth as she gasped. He had the entire look. With the sword on his back and the half mask covering his eyes, he was covered in red and black. She had heard about the Firefox for years, but she had never once seen him in a photograph. The articles in which he had starred had described his appearance, but he had always left a scene before a shot could be taken. She immediately reacted by taking a step back when he took one toward her. With a soft sigh, he raised his hands in silence. He lulled, his voice deep and smooth, "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you, I'm a friend." She remained motionless as he took another step forward, but she continued to hold the kunai in her hand. Is it a trick? A genjutsu? Was it an illusion that Zabuza or his assistant was attempting to pass her? Well, until she was certain of what was real and what wasn't, she wasn't going to let her guard down. Tazuna, who was looking at the child in wonder, approached the boy called Fire Fox. Only a few days ago, this hero had saved their shipment. He was as young as the genin, which is why, nevertheless, he appeared to have an extraordinary sense of authority at such a young age, as evidenced by the power display he just displayed. It was pretty startling. Fire Fox grinned and extended a hand. "Need a hand?" he said in a gentle tone. The bridge builder accepted it with gratitude, and the teenager, whose face showed no signs of effort, jerked him to his feet. Tazuna's feet even lifted an inch or two off the ground as he shot up into a standing position. His eyes grew wide. He was more powerful than he appeared. Fire Fox shoved his hands into his pockets and grinned once more. Sakura narrowed her eyes and cautiously approached, her curiosity growing along with her guard. With his strength, sword, mask, and appearance, he really gave off the impression that he was the real deal. Everything was so convincing. She whispered, are you really him?" He turned and grinned softly, his smile so bright it made the girl flush. He cocked his head toward the bridge's entrance, where his flaming wall had been burning brightly just minutes before, and asked, "Do you need another demonstration?" Sakura shook her head and gave a small giggle. Sakura asked out loud, her jade eyes shiny with curiosity, "No, I think that was a pretty convincing move. And if you don't mind me asking, how did you do that? I've never seen anything like it. I mean, shooting fire from your hands, and I never heard you say a jutsu, or form hand seals." Though it returned almost immediately, the boy's smile wavered a bit. He gave a vague explanation, raising more questions than he addressed, saying, "It's a gift I acquire, a forbidden tactic if you will." When his head twitched and his eyes twitched slightly, Sakura opened her mouth to speak again. His eyes wandered and twisted until they focused on a single object as he turned to the left and glared into the mist. His right hand twitched toward the hilt of his blade as he muttered, "It looks like your friend is in a little trouble." "Sasuke." Sakura's eyes grew wide. Leaning forward, Fire Fox slid his left foot behind him. He said simply, "I'm on it." Then, before the pinkhead could react, he vanished in a swirl of glowing smoke. Sasuke. A startling shock went straight up the Uchiha's arms as he fell to the ground, his hands hitting the ground hard. His vision became blurry as he exhaled loudly and wiped away the blood that was pouring freely into his eye. His eyes flashed dangerously as he yanked 2 needles out of the top of his foot and tossed them carelessly aside. Haku grinned as he hid in a mirror in the upper right corner. The weapons glinted as he held 3 thin ice pins in his hand. He whispered, winding back to land the last blow, "This will finish it." Just as a fist smashed through the plane, breaking it into numerous tiny shards that fell to the ground like a deadly rain, his eyes widened and he leapt quickly from his hiding place. Haku looked at the newcomer as he rolled to the ground and skidded to a stop close to a bottom mirror. Sasuke looked up too, wondering who could have broken the seemingly unbreakable jutsu. Naruto grinned and said, "I've come to join your little party." Haku's arms trembled under him as he began to pull himself up off the ground, threatening to fail. His mask covered eyes never left the newcomer, his mind constantly spinning. "Although I don't remember seeing him prior to the battle in the Land of Fire, this is the boy I met this morning who knew my real name." Naruto approached Sasuke, who was half on his knees and half on the ground. "Need some assistance, O great Uchiha?" he said, offering a helping hand. Sasuke frowned, but it was a grudging one. For once, he took the blonde's extended hand and held on tightly as the teenager heaved him to his feet. Sasuke became suspicious right away because the blonde appeared to do everything without any effort at all. And yet, he was in front of him, struggling to get someone to stand up. What had he been up to lately? With a sly smile, Naruto turned back to face Haku and effortlessly assumed a stance. With his fists raised in defense, Naruto remarked, "Stand back and get a rest in, it looks like you need one." Like a puppet being pulled by wires from a dropped position, Haku also rose from the cement floor. Both of the Konoha shinobi in attendance found it to be rather unnatural and unsettling, but Naruto had witnessed worse. Haku asked with confidence in his voice, "Your teammate could not defeat me, what makes you think you can?" Naruto gave a shrug. He responded lightheartedly and playfully, "Difference in talents." This was just too strange, and Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Why was he suddenly happy, sardonic, and cheerful again after more than a week of being aloof, quiet, and brooding? On Sakura's bad days, this guy was even more of a roller coaster. "So," Naruto said, instantly crouching down and his tone shifting to one of seriousness, "let's get this started, shall we?" Haku squinted and complied with his response, separating his feet in preparation for action. A second went by, with the only sound coming from metal clashes somewhere beyond the mirror walls in the nearby section of the bridge. Then the two vanished, vanishing in blue and black bursts. Sasuke attempted to follow, but his eyes were unable to keep up and only managed to give him a headache. In the middle of the broad circle, Senbon and Kunai collided with a smash. They flew apart with the force of a throw, though, before much more could happen. With his teeth clenched, Naruto skidded to a halt. Stupid jutsu, my body is getting heavier by the second. Seeing his chance, Haku ran at the blonde while he was sleeping. Naruto, however, wasn't stupid. He sidestepped and performed a somersault. Thinking quickly, he landed on his feet and launched himself into a run. I can't pull off anything elegant, but it's not like I could anyway with the chakra I have left. Haku lunged at him once more, but the blonde sidestepped the blow by sliding to the right. The cold, wet air on the bridge filled his lungs as he took a deep breath. Relax your muscles and think quickly and nimbly. With his eyes no longer useful, Naruto closed them and opened his ears, his senses becoming more acute. He barely avoided a swipe at his feet before he flipped up into the air due to a whoosh of air on his left. When his eyes opened, he saw a fist flashing at his face. He threw up his arms to shield his face from the blow because he was too late to dodge. It sent him flying backwards after striking him hard in the middle of his forearms. The force of his impact caused the glassy surface of one of the ice-packed mirrors behind him to shatter. He tried to suppress a whimper of pain from the pain that was buried deep in his bones, but he let out a little cry as he fell into a slump on the ground. Despite his body's loud pleas for him to stop, he quickly got up and moaned inwardly. Sasuke, who was in his corner of the prison, watched in disbelief. In fact, this girl was causing some trouble for the sensation with the cerulean eyes. His inner self began rubbing his hands together and he smiled evilly. Everyone back home would be thrilled to hear that their prodigy had failed against a girl. Haku briefly grinned before charging at Naruto once more, quickly exploiting his vulnerability. Naruto ducked under his senbon-filled punch, but he was able to catch another deftly thrown jab. He also managed to avoid that one, but it was a bit too late that he noticed the needles between his fingers. It grazed his side and sliced through his jacket and undershirt. At first, it wouldn't have bothered him at all. If it had just been the blade, it wouldn't have hurt at all, even now. However, a thin layer of a particular kind of poison covered the tips about a thumb's length in, and as soon as it broke skin, it entered the blonde teen's bloodstream. The left side of his stomach erupted in flames instantly, and the searing pain spread like a match and crept up to the side of his face. His leg gave out under his weight, causing him to half fall and roll to the ground as he moaned and rolled sideways. Next to the Uchiha, who grinned smugly, he landed with a gentle thud. With sarcasm in his voice, he asked airily, "Not having any trouble, are you, oh genius?" With a frown, Naruto swallowed the stinging, burning stabs that were still present. He leapt into a crouch and began to run, keeping his head down. Taking a deep, ragged breath, he clenched his fist and gave the masked boy a sudden burst of speed. The coal-haired boy only skidded back about a foot when Senbon and fist collided, but it didn't really knock him off balance. As though in passing, Haku told him, "You can't win, you don't have the right goals to beat me." The voice in the back of Naruto's mind was screaming at the top of its lungs to stop the excessive movement, but he ignored it and gritted his teeth and pushed back hard. He narrowed his eyes and growled back, "And what goal would that be?" Haku grinned, or at least that's what the blonde could infer from the mask covering his face. He spat, his voice rising with each word until even Sasuke could hear his little speech word for word. "You lack the want to grasp your dreams, to trample on anything and anyone in your way to get to it. You don't have the courage to risk everything you have to get it done, and you certainly are absent in the skill to do it either." Naruto's jaw tightened. He was angry now. No ability? As though. He muttered, "That is where you're wrong." Then, with a burst of energy, he vanished, releasing all the effort he had been exerting to hold the Konoha shinobi back. After falling forward, Haku quickly got back up and skillfully flipped back onto his feet. He spun around in a desperate attempt to find his escaped opponent. He stumbled forward, arms flailing as he attempted to regain his balance after taking a sudden blow to the back. Naruto disappeared before he could turn to attack once more, this time entering from the ground and rising. The mist shinobi crashed into the ice ceiling after he gave him a hard kick to the stomach, sending him flying. There was a startling impact on his body, and the air exploded from his lungs. Then, with a soft moan, Haku collapsed back onto the cement floor, landing on his left side and then sprawling onto his stomach. Using this opportunity, Naruto ran to Sasuke's seat and began extracting needles from his clothing. He crouched and gazed at the slowly expanding heap of thin projectiles covered in blood. After a few seconds of silence, Naruto abruptly said, "I've got a plan, but you need to trust me." Raising an eyebrow, Sasuke looked up from his work. With a slight smirk, he said cynically, "Is that even possible with you? You're always changing personalities so fast, it's hard to figure out who you really are. Starting to give me whiplash, you know." Naruto rolled his eyes. Itachi was foolish to put him in this predicament. Instead of requiring him to play undercover super spy, couldn't they have launched an attack? He looked at the enormous mirror behind them and sighed, saying, "Well, if we want to get out of here, you're going to have to put those things out of your mind. It's gonna take a lot to get you out of here." Sasuke's brow furrowed and his eyes grew wide. The Uchiha argued, "Me? Why is that singular? What about you, hotshot?" Naruto grinned. He looked up and down at Sasuke, noting the numerous puncture wounds, and said, "Well, by the looks of things, I'm the only one capable of taking him down." Sasuke frowned, a flare of frustration lighting up his charcoal eyes. "And why should I agree to this plan of yours? It just sounds like you want to hog all the glory, as usual," he complained. Naruto's eyes grew a little wider in shock. "I'm just doing whatever it takes to get us out of here alive, Sasuke. And you should listen, because someone needs to be out there helping Sakura and Tazuna." Naruto took a breath and said, "And I don't want to see any of you guys get hurt. I know we're supposed to get past this." In an instant, Sasuke's ferocious glare vanished, turning into a shocked expression. For the first time in his life, he bowed his head and appeared guilty. He muttered, avoiding eye contact with the blonde, "Oh, sorry about the outburst then." Naruto grinned. He laughed, making the Uchiha smile a little wider. "It's no big deal, I mean, we gotta remember my PMS. Like personality, right?" he said. Naruto took a deep breath of the chilly bridge air as he stood there. Then, suddenly, with new strength, he dashed at the mist ninja. The senbon that was thrown at him clashed with him. He squatted back down after skidding to the ground. He leapt back up and launched another attack, attempting to kick him in the side. After it was deflected, he flipped over his head and aimed a jab at the base of his neck, continuing on his line of battle. Once more, blocked. A dent was left on the cement after Naruto hit it with a devastating smash. With the strength of a Junin, he snarled and leapt to his feet, twisting elegantly to deliver an upward roundhouse kick. However, Naruto changed course and ultimately delivered a side blow, sending the black-haired boy flying, as Haku attempted to defend himself against that move. Simultaneously, a sharp pain erupted in his abdomen. It seemed as though a million brush fires were starting simultaneously and intensifying in intensity. Naruto landed heavily on his back after gasping and falling to the ground. He let out a groan and sat down, clutching his midsection and pleading with the scorching heat to stop. Haku used the back of his hand to wipe a stray line of blood from his mouth after he got himself up off the ground. On the opposite side of the arena, he saw Naruto doubling over, his face contorted in excruciating pain. He grinned as he realized that this was his last opportunity to eliminate this irritation from his life. He muttered some dark, low words and made a one-handed sign. A huge cloud of ice needles appeared out of thin air in a flash. The blonde was still unaware when the mist ninja lifted his hand and threw them into the air with a quick flick of his wrist. Although Sasuke was aware of the danger emanating from him, Naruto was still unaware of it. With a slight increase in color, his vision returned to him as the strange wave of agonizing pain subsided. He blinked several times, but the image remained somewhat hazy. Then he looked up, nearly toppling over with shock. There was a small pool of blood at his feet, and Sasuke was half standing, half crouching protectively in front of him. There was a needle embedded every few inches on his body, possibly inserted about 1/3 of the way. His face, which was now contorted in pain, was the only area that was spared. Haku was stunned because he had not anticipated the Konoha shinobi to leap in front of his attack. When he had seen them earlier, the team had not appeared to be particularly close, especially to the blonde. However, he had greatly underestimated them, and although it was pretty good to kill one, his true target was spared for the time being. Sasuke, Naruto muttered in wonder, his expression simultaneously bewildered and appalled. With a grunt, the boy with the raven hair dropped to his knees, trembling all over. Naruto knelt beside him after crawling the short distance between them. He could now see the full scope of the attack. A small ring of blood, some with streaming lines that dripped from his arms and legs, and perhaps 100 senbons stuck in his skin were all causing holes in his clothing and adding to the puddle that was forming in front of him. He gasped, his words thick and sputtered, "You need to go, they need you." A drop of blood splattered across his hand as he coughed and it came from his throat. Naruto gaped, searching for a response, but came up empty-handed. To be honest, he was at a loss for words. This sacrifice was the first time anyone had ever done this for him. Hell, he hardly knew how to handle human life, much less an act of kindness, so it was a whole new thing. Yes, he is all mighty, but after years of deadly, rigorous training, he still can't handle a friend's heart. He rolled onto his back and then sank onto his side, adding, "Do whatever you were gonna do to get me out of here, it'll be fine." With a wavering and shaky action, he sighed. "I guess, my brother will remain in this world. My goal will never be fulfilled." When Naruto heard the Uchiha murmur these words, his stunned stupor was blown away. Crawling over, he carefully extracted a needle that was lodged beneath the boy's kneecap. Even though it slid out rather easily, Sasuke hissed because the damage was already done. Disregarding the mist shinobi behind him, Naruto stumbled to his feet and whispered, "What are you talking about?" Sasuke exhaled deeply. "My brother did something horrible, a long time ago. It was by goal, by dream, to make things right," he said. His eyes were closed and his head tilted to the side. "But this is good too." After blinking a few times, Naruto carefully withdrew his hand from the senbon he was going to remove from Sasuke's shoulder. "Sasuke?" The boy's body remained motionless on the bridge's surface, unresponsive. The blonde's heart rate rose as he swore and felt for a pulse. However, there was not a single beat beneath his fingers. Freeze, he dropped back to his knees. Now uncertain of what to do, he buried his head in his hands. Haku laughed from the other side of the yard. He dismissed himself by saying, "Looks like he just didn't have the right stuff to survive a ninja life." Naruto's head was up and his jaw was clenched in a flash. The blonde growled, "Shut it, cross dresser." And you know, it sucks for him, knowing that the person he saved. He reiterated his warning, "You'd better watch it." Doesn't even care. Then again, he shouldn't have tried to be a hero. What a fool. In an instant, the agitated expression vanished. Naruto's cerulean eyes flashed with the intent to kill, and his face lit up with rage. Every fiber of his body was filled with a fury that surged forward. Then, in a wash of crimson red, everything vanished. The boy with the raven hair recoiled in a sudden gust of wind, protecting his face from the merciless winds. An intense power source filled the air, and the amount of chakra in one area made the room appear to get smaller. Taking a chance, Haku looked up and was shocked by what he saw. The blonde's feet were encircled by red tendrils that waved like the wind, seemingly acting independently. His immediate surroundings also took on a bloody hue, forming a misty cloud around his sagging body. His throat produced a deep, guttural snarl that was menacing and definitely not human. He slowly lifted his head, revealing his face as the massive chakra flow began. However, he was no longer the typical blue-eyed, expressionless Konoha shinobi that Haku was familiar with. Rather, the cerulean had disappeared, turning crimson red as it melted. With a more fierce physique, the thin lines on the small trio of scars on each cheek had changed to a much bolder and harsher appearance. His fingernails had grown about half an inch longer than usual, and his mouth was now open in a growl, with fangs sticking out from his upper lip. The only thing left was something otherworldly, his pupils slit, and any trace of the boy he had been gone. With his hands grazing the floor, Naruto lowered himself into a crouch. The mirrors above him cracked and groaned, threatening to fall apart as he threw his head back and roared. Uncertain whether to try to fight it out or break the jutsu and flee, Haku took a tired step back. However, the move was a mistake because Naruto saw the brief burst of movement and fixed his gaze on the boy with the raven hair. And then, suddenly, he was running, his body a blur. Haku's heart thumped hard against his chest as his eyes grew wide. He reached into his pocket and tossed a handful of senbon haphazardly at the ninja that was moving quickly toward him. Naruto slashed out with one hand just as it appeared that they would hit their target. It swirled out in a maroon wave, obstructing the boy's body like a shield, like wind. Controlled water. The mist shinobi anticipated that the needles would phase through as they struck the surface, which appeared to be non-existent. He was surprised, however, when they bounced off as though they were striking metal and fell to the ground ineffectively. Naruto charged, running on all fours like some kind of beast, before Haku had a chance to recover or even come up with a plan for a comeback. In an instant, he was beside him and tried to knock his feet out from under him by striking out with his leg. The mist shinobi, however, flipped away and made a covert landing. But a fist struck his face, sending him flying before he could even straighten up. With his back arching from the impact and his breath rushing out of his lungs, he collided with one of his mirrors. In its reflective sheen, the surface broke, revealing an unrecognizable image. He didn't need to look to see that his nose was broken and heavily bleeding, but his face was pounding painfully. It didn't end there, either. The blonde charged forward, twisted, and kicked him in the middle of his stomach. Haku's face twisted in agony as he watched the mirror behind him slowly give way due to too much force and pressure for the unique ice. Looking glass to withstand. With a bone. Jarring thud, the masked ninja struck the ground. He then rolled painfully, his side skidding across the surface. When his body slid over a small piece of metal that hadn't been bent back into place yet, the cool iron bit into his skin, cutting his left side about 1.5 inches. The crash reverberated in the air as he struck the sturdy guard rail on the bridge's side. He had avoided his prison by a good 30 feet and the sharp steel arm by another couple of meters, leaving a smudging trail of blood that led to his gushing stomach. With a ferocious hand, Haku grabbed the rail and hauled himself up, keeping his side firmly closed. The weak sunlight glinting off the kunai he held firmly in his hand caused him to groan in agony as he saw Naruto hurrying at him. The mist team did not bother to plan or defend, instead remaining motionless as stone. He couldn't beat a boy with this level of unadulterated talent. Zabuza would undoubtedly be let down and his usefulness would come to an end. Starvation in the wilderness was preferable to dying here at the hands of such a strong creature. He had always detested pain, so he closed his eyes and waited for the weapon to sting and cleave into his skin, hopefully killing him instantly. After that, nothing occurred. A demonic voice growled, "Fight back." With the kunai hovering just a few inches from his chest, Haku opened his eyes to find Naruto still in a half crouch in front of him. The blood-red eyes had vanished, returning to their typical sapphire blue, but his hair and scars were still wild and his fangs were clearly visible. "What?" Haku inquired, stepping back a little to get a better sense of calm and to get away from the point of the blade. Naruto's grip tightened noticeably as he lowered the knife to his side while gritting his teeth. He repeated, his voice starting to return to its normal pitch, "Fight back. I refuse to continue a battle without being attacked." Haku sighed with relief. Whatever had gripped the teenager just now was beginning to fade. "I have no reason to fight you. My use for Zabuza has run out, it's better for me to die here. So I ask you, do it. Plunge that kunai into my heart and take my life, it is after all, the ninja code." He replied in a monotone voice. The projectile dropped slack in Naruto's hand as he flinched back. In a single fluid motion, the blonde put the kunai back in his holster and whispered, "Never would I take the life of an innocent." Haku appeared perplexed. "How would you know anything about me being innocent? I've killed people when I was." "I know, you accidentally killed your dad when you were little with your powers, but it was only as he was about to kill you, and you didn't mean to do it." Naruto intervened. The teenager with the kohl hair appeared astonished. He asked hesitantly, How did you know?" Before continuing, Naruto grinned. In order to avoid being overheard, Naruto spoke quietly as he explained, "We've met before, twice actually. That one time in the woods, eliciting another widening of Haku's eyes. And when we were 8, almost 5 years ago. My master and yours met up on the road and we camped out together for a while. But, oh yes, now I remember. You were that little blonde boy I played with, that was so long ago," he murmured. Naruto gave a nod of agreement. Haku let out a sigh. "Then you know how much my master's opinion matters to me. It's my whole life, and if he has no use for me, then what do I have?" asked the man. "You could have an actual life. Go back to the village hidden in the mist, make friends, build a freaking birdhouse. But you don't have to die because your master is a psychopath." Naruto yelled, raising his arms. Haku scowled. "Then what's with you? You're in a village, on a team, have a ninja career, and are probably one of the strongest shinobi I've seen in a while. But you're still so unhappy, you don't even look at it all, you just want to live in your own little world," he replied. Naruto started to respond but stopped when he realized he was correct. He was living it and still appeared to despise it, despite his statements that it would be wonderful to settle down. If only he could be honest with Haku at least. Naruto said slowly, "I don't count Haku. It's not that I'm unhappy, it's just, I have obligations." Haku laughed. He whispered, "I still don't think that's any excuse." Naruto took a deep breath and exhaled slowly as he considered his next words. "You're not a tool, Haku. You're a living human being. Do what you want, not what you think your master would want. It is your life," said Naruto. All the Mist Boy could do was grunt and tighten his grip on his side, the wound beginning to bleed. "If you feel so strongly about this, then what's your excuse for your life's purpose?" He was absolutely correct, so it was undoubtedly a low blow. Given that he was doing the exact same thing, how could Naruto tell this teenager to stop following his master's instructions? From the west section of the bridge, a holler rang out, piercing the atmosphere. As soon as he heard the sound, Naruto's still-tuned senses pricked up, and he instantly recognized the voice's location and owner. He turned slightly in the direction the scream had come from and muttered, "That's Tazuna." Haku drew a trembling breath. He clutched his side, a few drops of blood still dripping between his fingers, and gasped, "Zabuza's final attack has begun. The bridge production will come to a stop once that old man is out of the way." Uncertain of what to do and what would happen next, Naruto remained silent for a while. Instead of risking his life to save this nation or an elderly man, his goal was to infiltrate Konoha. However, that was incredibly cruel. Itachi would never advocate killing someone, but if it were in line with his objective. Then he suddenly realized. His heart pounded loudly in his chest as his eyes grew wide. Sakura was by herself watching over Tazuna. He felt that surge of anger, enforced power well up inside his gut again, but this time he suppressed it. The idea of anything happening to the pinkette made him flush. He clenched his jaw as he looked at the mist ninja with the raven hair. According to the shinobi code, you should never turn your back on an enemy, but... Haku was surprised when the blonde suddenly spun around and dashed into the mist, disappearing in a flash. He tried to stop him, but his left hip screamed in pain, so he bit his lip to keep from screaming. He let out a frustrated sigh. Unable to pursue him due to his condition, he sat huffily and bided his time. Naruto, on the other hand, was not wasting time or caring to slow down. He was moving faster than the human eye could see. He didn't even consider the fact that he was displaying more emotion now than he had since leaving the village. All he could think about was making it to his teammate on time. It didn't matter. Kakashi and Sasuke are no longer there. His sharp eyes saw the faint outline of two silhouettes against the water vapor. One was tall and lanky and was clearly on the defensive, while the other was smaller and was slashing at the figure repeatedly. So he whispered, "Sakura, he will have to go through me if he wants to kill her because she is the only one left." And he leapt without the slightest bit of common sense. Several minutes prior to, the Konoha sensei flipped backwards and skidded to a stop, his kunai clenched tightly in his bleeding hand. Zabuza grunted and shouldered his blade, ignoring the hole in his upper right arm. The mist shinobi growled under his breath and his eyes darted around, looking for something to use to eliminate the bothersome issue in front of him. "Are you out of inspiration?" Zabuza frowned as Kakashi taunted him, his breathing laboring. Then, suddenly, winds began to rush past the two, tearing at their strength and pushing them backwards. Zabuza's eyes widened. He had never experienced anything like the intense concentration of power within the gusts. Kakashi was equally astounded and frightened, and as he remembered whose chakra this was, a chakra he hadn't felt in over 12 years, he felt disassociated from his body. Did he know he had the demon contained, or has he let it loose? Kakashi was well aware that this was bad, really bad, if he had allowed the Biju to run loose, to take control of his body and his actions. If the boy did manage to turn into a demon to a certain degree, he would attack anything that breathed, and if it got to that point, his job would be to remove his pupil. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it dissipated in a hurricane, returning to its original location in the dense mist. For a brief moment, everything was quiet as the land held its breath, waiting for something to happen, but then everything was the same as before, with only the sound of rushing water beneath the bridge and a thick fog hanging overhead. Feeling a little relieved that the demon's power had been extinguished once more, Kakashi turned back to his opponent, assuming that after that outburst, Zabuza's little assistant would no longer pose a threat to the bridge builder, allowing him to concentrate all of his energy on the mist murderer in front of him. "Well, it appears to be just the two of us." Kakashi smiled and said, "And you can believe that you won't be a problem to Tazuna anymore." Zabuza grimaced. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but the Konoha ninja was correct. Things weren't looking good for him right now. It was best to finish the job. Zabuza sneered, "Sorry, but I'm not going down without a finish first." He used a string of nearly invisible seals to create a water clone that stood at his side, ready for action. "Go," he muttered, and the clone ran into the mist and vanished before Kakashi could even think. The gray-haired shinobi started to pursue him, but the real Zabuza flashed in front of him, slashing out with his sword. "Are you going somewhere?" the man hissed, and Kakashi let out a loud sigh before leaping away and barely avoiding the blow. It appears that his genin were on their own. Tazuna and Sakura, it happened too quickly for them to process. One minute it was quiet, the next it was rushing winds that nearly threw them off the bridge. Certainly not what you would expect. What was that? Sakura brushed pebbles off her clothing and peeled her body off the ground before Tazuna asked, pushing himself off the guardrail he was clinging to for his life. Tazuna scowled as she sighed, probably one of the boys playing with some high-powered jutsu. He remarked, "You act like this is everyday stuff." Sakura shrugged. The pinkette said, "I have a very interesting team, to put it mildly." Tazuna nodded but still looked around, as though he might be able to predict another outburst. Sakura was suddenly pushed hard from behind, falling to the ground and crashing into it. "Sakura!" The bridge builder yelled, but his voice was interrupted. The pinkette looked up and saw that Zabuza was lifting the old man off the ground by his neck. She jumped up in panic, reaching into her star pouch and flicking a few of the shuriken through the air. The metal flyers got stuck in the man's arms, and he growled, releasing the man. He growled and turned on the teenager. She slid away, missing the sword by a long shot, but he was quick, faster than anyone she had ever seen. He jabbed her in the side with his elbow, sending her crashing into the guardrail, and she cried out in pain as pain exploded from the top of her head, red washing out her vision. "You're going to pay for that, you little witch," he said dangerously. Sakura tried to move, but when she raised her head, it was covered in black spots. Instead, she felt Zabuza start to move toward her, preparing to remove her. Then, with a war cry and a flash of yellow, Naruto appeared, slamming his fist at the mist shinobi, his face stormy and dark, devoid of any trace of kindness or even the blank boredom that so often adorned his face. Sakura blinked quickly, trying to get the stars out of her line of sight, and then a hand gently pushed her up into a sitting position, leaning her body against the guard rail behind her. His hand abruptly made contact with Zabuza, causing her face to light up with surprise before exploding into a torrent of water that literally blew up and out with the force it was hit with. "Are you okay?" Naruto asked, identifying him as the pair of caretakers' hands assisting her. Sakura nodded weakly, her neck crying out with the movements. With a groan, she lifted her hand to the base of her collarbone and in a flare of green, the throbbing pain began to recede in healing. "And you, Tazuna?" "Yes, I'm fine," the elderly man must have said, nodding. "I appreciate you saving their young man." "How's your head, Sakura?" the bridge builder asked. "You took a nasty blow there." Sakura grinned. The old man relaxed and smiled softly as she reassured him, "I'm good, just a few minutes of this and I'll be good as new, you'll see." "Fantastic. We should probably locate Kakashi now." For a moment, Naruto's eyes became sad and he tensed. "Are you certain he's still alive?" Sakura and Tazuna exchanged a perplexed glance as the blonde inquired. "Why wouldn't he be, then?" Sakura answered, but her voice lacked confidence. Naruto winced. "With Kakashi present, how could he have produced that water clone?" He replied, I guess he could be going fine. We don't know for sure, I'm just saying, it doesn't look that great." The Kunoichi got her teammate's point and nodded solemnly, but she still had a hunch that Kakashi was still with them, somewhere in the mist. Whatever became of the other boy wearing the mask? Sasuke, too? Tazuna asked, and Sakura glanced at the blonde in the same way, wondering the same thing. Naruto bit his lip and turned away, looking at the ground in silence. Sakura became concerned right away because she assumed that even though the teenager was known for his sporadic quiet outbursts, this wasn't the moment he would refuse to talk. With her heart almost stopping in its tracks, Sakura whispered, "Naruto, don't tell me." Naruto closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. The blonde finally said in a low voice, "He took a blow, for me." The pinkette gasped, fighting back the wave of sadness and depression she felt and taking a shuddering breath, even though she had suspected it beforehand. "Will you take me to see him?" she asked softly, and Naruto nodded, his face unreadable, then turned and made a single-handed gesture, and two flawless copies of Naruto appeared next to him in an instant. The blonde then turned back to the bridge builder, who was holding his head in his hand in shock and sorrow. "Don't worry, my clones won't fail. They'll remain here with you." The blonde offered his hand to his fallen comrade, who accepted it gratefully, knowing full well that she wouldn't have been able to stand on her own. "And if something does happen to them, I'll know," Naruto promised, receiving a slight nod in return. And as Naruto guided her through the dense fog to where her longtime crush lay, motionless and frigid, she held on tight. Sasuke, not dead, but not alive either, he hung in the space of unconsciousness, likely trapped in a coma on the outside world, everything black and covered in shadows, if that was even possible, and all the while he felt as though he was being smothered by the claws of death. The pain was unbearable in every way, every part of his body throbbing in agony with every heartbeat, and he wished he could stop. Outside, Sakura was unable to move or speak when she saw Sasuke Uchiha's body lying limp on the hard cement. Instead, She just stared at the boy who had occupied her attention for the previous 7 years and collapsed to her knees, oblivious to the impact's sharp edge. She covered her mouth to try to hide her grief from the teenager behind her, but it was ineffective because the blonde next to her could see that she was crying. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and before she knew it, streams of them were streaming down her face and little sobs were racking from her chest. He felt a twinge of jealousy blossom through his chest for a moment as he watched the pink head crumble at the sight of their teammate's lifeless form, but he forced it away because there was no time or justification for such sentiments. He couldn't quite recall when Haku had attacked him, but he should have been able to avoid them, or at least take the hits himself. Naruto's gaze strayed from the raven-haired teen to the needles strewn about them, the blood on the ends already dried, though not much time had passed. His brow was furrowed as he stared at the senbon. The only thing that stood out boldly was the sudden, bubbling rage that had boiled up from the pit of his stomach just as he was picking himself off the ground. He had felt it only a few times, on the road with Itachi, when his training was too intense, and that one time when Sasuke had cut Sakura and he had healed it. It had been random and definitely not his, a power that was similar to his chakra but 10 times more intense, which was really saying something. Sakura looked up, her eyes red and puffy from crying, and she scowled in bewilderment as Naruto closed his eyes and placed his hand on his heart, then screwed up his eyes and furrowed his brow deeply, clearly focusing on something pretty hard. Naruto smirked and leapt over the pinkhead and the Uchiha, landing on the other side. He then whipped around and knelt down, cracking his knuckles as he prepared to try the inevitable. When Naruto saw the injury Sakura had sustained, he concentrated on his feelings of sympathy and desire to help, and then he multiplied them by 10 or 100, realizing that it would take more than a small amount of power to revive someone from a scratch. Sakura smirked and put his hand on Sasuke's chest, directly over his heart, and wiped the moisture from her eyes. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, but gradually, color began to return to the Uchiha's skin and Naruto felt his pulse quicken. He didn't take his hand off until he saw the boy's chest rise and fall with a lungful of air. Sakura gasped when Naruto's hand began to glow red, faint at first, then turning into a bright crimson beacon. When Sasuke's chest began to rise with air, Sakura smiled and felt tears well up in the corners of her eyes, but she pushed them away. Sakura's eyes widened as she watched the Uchiha grow healthier by the second, the blonde apparently using chakra to bring him back to life, though it didn't feel like it was his own. Sakura softly said, "Naruto, you saved him." Naruto smirked and leaned back, his breathing a little labored with exhaustion. Although the power was amazing and gave him a sense of invincibility, it took its toll rather quickly, which greatly disturbed him. Itachi had taught him to use his power sparingly but to expand it so that it was powerful but roomy, with breathing room. However, the tactics were ineffective for this. He would need to find another way to fully channel it. Suddenly, Naruto's still, heightened senses turned to somewhere on his left, and he felt a tug in the pit of his stomach and a jolt in his head. He felt fear and anxiety, victory and anger, commitment and decisiveness, and then he saw. With a crackling ball of energy in his hand, he saw Kakashi, thankfully still alive, rush toward Zabuza. The mist shinobi trapped, clinging to the ground as a dozen dogs sunk their teeth into his skin, securing him and making him immobile. He then saw Haku approaching the two at a fairly quick pace for an injured person, with a terrified yet determined expression on his face. Naruto glanced ahead of the boy's path and saw, with wide eyes, what he was attempting to accomplish. He was prepared to sacrifice his life in order to stop Kakashi's jutsu and save Zabuza. Unthinking, he pushed off his ground position and ran away, leaving a very bewildered Sakura in his wake. Naruto saw the mist begin to lighten, lifting as the dog's bites depleted Zabuza's energy. When Kakashi extended his hand to attack, Naruto did something Itachi would have called crazy because he was within striking distance of the three individuals and Haku was skidding in front of his master at that precise moment, invisible to everyone but Naruto due to his speed. His sensei was sent sprawling to the ground after he collided with him. Kakashi literally had no idea what had hit him. He was about to touch Zabuza's chest when he was thrown to the ground, the jar stiff and heavy. When his jutsu hit the pavement, it burst, and he fell painfully onto his side. The Junin did not lie on the bridge for long, helpless. In a flash, he was standing again, the rapid movements blacking out his vision. Holding his head tight, he waited for the swaying to end. "What the?" he muttered, blinking quickly to try to get rid of the spots that were obstructing his vision. He was taken aback when he eventually saw Naruto standing in front of him with his arms out in front of them, palms calmly facing out. Although his posture was firm and menacing, his face stood out, its blue eyes gleaming with worry. Kakashi's eyes grew wide, his mind racing with the circumstances, and he felt his heart leap into a canter. Was Naruto protecting Zabuza? Why was he doing this, and what was going on? Was he among them? With a harsh and questioning tone, the Junin said, "Naruto, what is the meaning of this?" His hand crept toward his kunai holster, and his eyebrows shot up when a few seconds passed without an explanation. With a sidestep, Naruto unveiled the now visible Haku, who was equally as surprised as the others. Kakashi asked, "And you think this excuses you?" The blonde's shoulders dropped as he deflated. To the Konoha shinobi's surprise, Naruto said in a panic, "Kakashi. Sensei, you didn't see what I did. I mean, you were coming in with your jutsu to kill Zabuza, but Haku saw it too. And he feels a deep connection to him, so he made a move to jump in the way. And I just couldn't watch Haku die." His forehead furrowed in perplexity. With suspicion in his voice, he questioned, "What do these mist shinobi mean to you, Naruto?" Naruto searched his mind for something to say. He would rather die than tell them about Itachi or his plans, but if he didn't quickly and convincingly think of an excuse, everything would be ruined. He finally decided on a half-truth, and there's nothing wrong with that, is there? "I was 8 years old when I first met Haku and Zabuza, traveling alone on the road. I stayed with them for a few days. It had been a while since I had seen another human being. Haku and I got to be close. I mean, 2 young kids on the road, away from what they called home. We could relate to each other easier than others would. It was natural, but they moved on soon enough and I went in the opposite direction," Naruto said, omitting any hint of Itachi's involvement or the true reason they had discovered the mist defect. For a brief moment, the blonde believed that everything had been revealed and that he would have to leave, meaning that neither Itachi's nor his dream would ever come true, as Kakashi studied the young teen with a clenched jaw. However, the cautious gleam remained burning in Kakashi's eyes as he nodded slowly after a few seconds of awkward and uncomfortable silence. To the relief of the young blonde, he shifted his focus from Naruto to Zabuza. Kakashi said, more to himself than to the mist shinobi, "Now, the notorious question, what shall we do with you?" Haku's posture tightened and his eyes, which were dark earth in color, grew ominous. "I will not let you harm Zabuza. You must strike me down first," he said. Kakashi let out a frustrated sigh. This was getting so annoying. When he was an Anbu captain, life was so much simpler. Just kill the guy and move on. The gray-haired Junin remarked, "Now let's hold on a second here. This can be resolved without anyone having to die." Naruto raised an eyebrow as the 3 other ninjas looked at each other. He said casually, sarcasm leaking out of his voice, "It must be nice in the fantasy world you live in." Kakashi darkened his steel, gray eyes. He hissed back, "What did you say, traitor?" Significantly, this brought back a memory for Naruto. In an instant, his hand was on the hilt of his sword, and he bared his teeth, growling a menacing sound. The boy's sensei scowled because he was unsure if the boy's behavior was influenced by the Kyuubi's abrupt release or if this was just his true nature. Since they've known him for 3 weeks, he's been a block of ice on and off, so he wouldn't know. Was it really only 3 weeks? Kakashi's head throbbed as he moaned and rubbed his temples. Too much to contemplate. All of a sudden there was a loud, slow clapping. The group turned to see a short, gray-haired man standing a few feet away, grinning widely, holding a cane and glasses. He added air quotes around words that Zabuza must have used and said, "Congratulations, kid. You beat the best." The mist ninja clenched his fists and snarled under his breath. He growled, "Gato." Kakashi arched an eyebrow. According to the bingo book, Gato was notorious for raising people in massacres and annexing their land, forcing them into poverty. A country of thunder once existed, but they were so impoverished that they all simply vanished. It's likely that the land of the wave would suffer the same fate if he carried on as he was doing here. Gato sneered and tapped his cane against his shoe's toe. "So you were beaten easily it seems, and by a little boy no less. It appears to me that the demon of the mist isn't so demonic now. A days, he asked. Behind the bandages covering his lower face, Zabuza tensed, his teeth gritting visibly. The older man swore and grinned dangerously, saying, "Well, I do believe your usefulness has run out. Your partnership with me is terminated." Naruto almost erupted in laughter. "What kind of line is that? Oh man, I knew the bad guys weren't the greatest at throwing jabs, but come on, my grandma would cuss you out and you'd be running for cover." Naruto gasped involuntarily. Kakashi gave the blonde a brief smirk. His upbeat demeanor was slightly illuminating the situation. Zabuza complained, his gaze fixed only on the face of his former client. "Haku, you know what to do." After nodding, the mist boy hurried toward the short man. But instead of moving or even showing any signs of fear, Gato wore a tight smile. Gato snapped his fingers as Haku approached him and was about to punch him. 24 men suddenly leapt from the still, thick fog and charged at the gullible teenager. He was sent to the ground after a heavy dot-set goon grabbed him by the head and slammed it down. After being roughly kicked in the side by a lanky one, Haku vanished into the sea of hitmen. Sakura, even though Naruto had only been gone for a few minutes, she had to admit that, even though he was just a slab of stone, she felt incredibly alone without him. All she could do was kneel and watch Sasuke take his next shallow breath and hope he was okay. That Naruto was alright. Kakashi was alright. That Tazuna was alright. She never really seemed to do anything but wait and pray. Why did she constantly sit on the sidelines while the boys kicked someone in the ass? Was she truly that frail? Did she require protection all the time? She had never given it much thought before graduating. However, their greatest mission to date was to attack and defeat a straw dummy, which they occasionally failed to do. She had a strong desire to enter the ninja industry at that time and eliminate anyone posing a threat to Konoha village. However, since then, everything has changed and been viewed from a new angle. She did have personal time with Sasuke Uchiha and was on the same team as the two jerks from Konoha, but that didn't really mean much anymore. Less than a month ago, she reflected on how fortunate she was to be on Sasuke's team, how he would recognize her potential as a shinobi and be impressed by her skill and intelligence. However, what skill had he observed thus far? His thoughts on her being dead weight? What was Naruto's opinion? Naruto, the blonde, just stared in shock as he saw his old friend and present adversary fall victim to an enemy attack while being dogged, piled by a group of Gato's goons. All he could do was watch as they smashed his head into the cement, causing cracks where it touched and causing blood to start pouring heavily from the chafing sores on his head. All he could do was watch as he was viciously kicked, punched, stabbed, and jabbed. He wanted to help. He knew he had to move. However, his legs refused to move no matter how hard he tried. He just couldn't get there quickly enough to save him, for whatever reason. He was aware of the reason. Itachi's insane teachings should be cursed. The blonde's eyes widened when he realized that, for the first time, he had just had a negative thought about his friend, Sensei, and only remained family. And the thought of what might have happened if Itachi had been nearby when he had that thought made him shudder. To put it vaguely, the notorious Uchiha definitely did not consider thoughts to be private. He was startled out of his reverie by cries of agony and discovered a bloodied Haku on the ground, attempting to remove some senbon from his star pouch. He tried, but the men wouldn't let him. He was grabbed by the collar by a burly man who then pounded him to the ground with a huge wind back. When Naruto's legs finally gave way, he went to kick all of those bastards in the ass because he could take it no more. He accelerated, and he saw Haku look up as someone approached him through his injured ears. When he realized it was the aloof blonde saving his life, his eyes grew wide. However, the gang members also noticed him. Sneering, a mediocre looking man drew a sword from his side and quickly drew it out. Gritting his teeth, Naruto braced himself for the man's assault. To his surprise, however, the hitman's blade went right through the boy's heart at his feet. Naruto halted abruptly, astonishment rising within him. Haku let out a cry of pain and froze for a moment before his head fell limp to the cement floor and his eyes slowly closed. His blood was still dripping beneath him as he exhaled his final breath. With a satisfied smirk, the man let go of the hilt, allowing the blade to protrude from the teenager's body at a slight angle. As he approached the dead body, Gato grinned gleefully, as though he had just received a puppy for his birthday. He pointed his cane sharply at the raven-haired child's head and said, "This is what happens when you're too weak to serve me." With his eyes burning, Naruto stepped forward menacingly as he jolted out of his daze. He screamed, "Leave him alone," as his hands clenched into fists so tightly that blood seeped between them. Gato chuckled. He laughed and pummeled Haku's body with the piece of wood even more forcefully, saying, "Oh, the leprechaun is angry. I'm shaking in my boots." With his wrath raging like an uncontrollable fire, Naruto turned back to Zabuza after swallowing a growl of rage. He rushed back to the two older shinobi and yelled, "Are you just going to stand there and let him do that to him?" Instead, Zabuza gave a non-committal shrug. He said softly, "He's dead, kid, what does it matter?" Even Zabuza shifted a little uncomfortably as Naruto's face turned ashen gray and his eyes flickered dangerously. He screamed, his anger rising once more in the pit of his stomach. "So what if he's dead? So what if he can't feel a goddamn thing? So what, he was your student, your friend, and your devoted follower, and you're going to let him treat Haku like that?" He chuckled a little as he absorbed the anger that washed over him, feeling a sort of presence filling his conscience. And what do you propose I do? Zabuza shot back, his eyes revealing his true feelings despite his cool-headed manner. Grief swirled in the black depths, and the glisten of tears was shining in the stormy, dark black orbs. Naruto yelled, his eyes darting quickly between crimson and sapphire. Fight back. Whoop that guy's ass. But don't just stand there and watch while he defiles the child you've known for years. Zabuza paused, mentally replaying what the boy had said. Naruto tightened his jaw and let out a loud sigh. The blue-eyed blonde snarled, okay, if you, the person he respected the most, don't defend him, then the person he hardly knows will. He spun around and threw himself at Gato and his thugs before anyone could stop him. Sakura. When Sakura heard Naruto's voice piercing the mist, everything fell eerily silent. Sakura jumped and Sasuke flinched at the intensity of the cry, indicating that his senses were returning. What is Naruto talking about, I wonder? A groan suddenly came from beneath her, and Sakura looked down to see Sasuke staring back at her with bewildered eyes. When she saw him look around and support himself on his elbows, the pinkhead nearly burst into tears. He asked in a monotone, what happened? I'm not quite sure about the whole story, but when Naruto brought me here, you were lying on the pavement, dead I think. But then Naruto did something. His hand glowed red and there was this big whisk of power originating from his body and then you started breathing again. Sasuke, I think he brought you back from the dead. Sakura clarified, the truth dawning on her as she talked. Sasuke gave an incredulous shake of his head. That's preposterous, that technique is forbidden. No one knows how to perform it. Especially not Naruto, right? Sakura's only answer was a shrug, and Sasuke was sent to reflect. The teen had far more power than he wanted to display if Naruto had brought him back to life. However, how could someone so inexperienced and youthful be so strong? Naruto had been displaying some rather odd abilities for someone who claimed to have been by himself for the previous 8 years, now that he had the time to consider it. He actually fought in a few ways that made him think of someone he knew. But before he could speak, a savage, untamed, and demon-like yell erupted. The two genin looked at each other and knew exactly what it was from that one glance. Naruto Sakura stood up quickly and turned to face the source of the sound. She glanced down at her crush and said, I have to go see if he's okay. You'll be alright. For a brief moment, Sasuke was taken aback by her swift action, which also affected Naruto. It was a welcome change, no doubt. He cocked his head in the direction they thought Naruto was going and nodded absently. Shortly, he said, go. Sakura responded by dipping her head, then quickly vanishing from view as she ran into the mist. Gathering his strength for what must be a long walk, Sasuke sighed and curled his legs up Indian style. He could not possibly have missed this. A few minutes ago, Naruto, he launched himself into the crowd, launching himself into a furious roundhouse kick. Naruto smirked with satisfaction as he felt the bone break beneath his foot as it struck the cheekbone of a burly man brandishing an axe. He heard the others rush toward them, their weapons burning. He smiled as he landed, squatted, spun quickly on his heel, and then lunged once more, slamming a chakra-filled blow into a man's jaw. He staggered away from the fight, his victim yowling in pain as he held his cracked jaw. Under his breath, the blonde let out a hysterical laugh. It was so satisfying to release the repressed rage and murderous intent he had inexplicably developed over the previous hour. Hearing the screams of pain coming from the mouths of the injured, and feeling their body crumble to dust under his blows, it only strengthened his resolve to destroy them all. Kakashi's forehead furrowed in anxiety. From what he could see, the boy was refusing to accept the power coursing through his veins, but he felt a presence he knew all too well. He was a bit too quick, though, because one of Naruto's victims was picking himself up off the ground and massaging the back of his head where it had hit the cement floor. He withdrew his hand, smearing the palm of his hand with a dark, rosy liquid. Naruto stopped abruptly, and his eyes widened. After closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, something inside of him came alive. With his fingernails growing longer, his scars becoming more hazy, and his fangs sticking out from his upper lip, his eyes suddenly flashed back to the scarlet red they had been only 30 minutes earlier. A sudden, faint flash of red glowed around the blonde's body and then was reabsorbed, stopping Kakashi's heart. When he saw long teeth emerge from his mouth and his eyes turn blood red, the silver-haired Junin became alarmed. All Naruto wanted at that moment was blood, lots of it, as his desire to kill overcame him and consumed every thought in his head. He felt more than 10 men pile him in a flash, their combined weight pulling him to the ground. However, his rage gave him new strength, and he threw them all off with a grunt of effort, sending them flying in all directions at high speeds. Others weren't so fortunate. Some crashed into crates, slamming through the brittle wood or striking the steel bars close to the edges, causing the metal to bend under the force of the impact. His gaze searched the crowd for his next victim before settling on the man who had just moments before arrogantly stabbed his friend in the back. When the man's eyes met the blonde's bloodthirsty orbs, they widened, and he stepped back in fear. A very poor move. The red-eyed teen was only prompted to attack by the fearful movement, and jumped at him with an excited smile. His so-called buddies did not attempt to stop the Konoha shinobi as he threw the man to the ground. The blonde forced him to the ground and pressed his knee firmly into the center of his back. Sakura's breathing became labored as she suddenly emerged from the mist. It turned out that they were literally on the other side of the bridge, from one edge to the other, from Sasuke. In the dense, rolling fog that covered the ground, it had taken her a good, solid minute or so to find the group. She was ecstatic to see Kakashi alive when she first saw him. She also noticed Zabuza, who was standing close to her sensei and appeared to be unharmed. However, they were staring at something across the bridge with wide eyes rather than attacking or even attempting to approach one another. Sakura focused on the current object of interest after following their line of sight. Naruto was kneeling on the back of a man and pressing his knee against his back. Sakura was disoriented and perplexed. What had transpired during Naruto's brief absence? It couldn't have changed people's lives that much. She then noticed the body of Haku, the boy who had previously attacked Sasuke, and his back was pierced by the sword. Sakura's hand instantly went to her mouth. He was definitely dead. As her gaze returned to her blonde teammate, she became aware of an oddity. His eyes were typically a clear cerulean, usually emotionless and lifeless. Now, however, the color had changed to a bright and vivid carnation red, and they were glistening with joy and triumph. Naruto took the man's arm in his fist and yanked it violently upward, pulling it diagonally across the man's back. Naruto moved to a stand and planted his foot in place of his knee as he pulled harder and harder, causing the thug beneath him to scream in agony. Naruto screamed and snapped his hand shut, saying, "So, you enjoy pain, huh? Enjoy agony, right? Well, here's some pain you'll never forget." The man's face twisted in agony as the throbbing from his now broken wrist shot up his shoulder, and the arm bone in his grasp crunched before his might. He screamed loudly. Although Sakura didn't know Naruto well, she was well aware that he wasn't a murderer, so she gaped in horror. Contrary to what he had said, he was now slowly draining the hitman beneath him of his vitality. "Naruto," she muttered, and before she knew it, she was sprinting in his direction, her heart pounding wildly as the blonde pulled his blade from his back and hung it perilously over Gato's hire. "Deja vu, right? Well, the tables are turned. It's your time to die," he shouted. He flinched back, prepared to stab the man in the body. As Sakura watched the scene play out, tears began to form in the corners of her eyes. Naruto was going to kill him, so she wouldn't get there in time. "Naruto." With her form leaning protectively over the man's body, Sakura threw herself over it after skidding to a stop. She raised her head and met the blonde's eyes. However, she was shocked to see a fierce, blood-red, crazed, and unstable blue instead of the typical emotionless, cerulean blue. It was a whisper, "Naruto, this isn't you." Under his breath, Naruto snarled and lifted the sword in his hand, prepared to murder them both. Sakura screamed, "Naruto! Stop! Snap out of it!" In a desperate attempt to reunite with her somewhat familiar teammate. She would rather have him as a stoic stone than the murderer he was turning into. Mindscape. A cry of desperation struck Naruto's head as he was lost in the murky, dark recesses of his mind. He tried to remember who the voice belonged to, but all memories were far away and unreachable at the moment. A second, more familiar figure shouted, "Sakura! Move!" from a greater distance than the first. "Sakura!" Naruto cocked his head. What was happening? Suddenly, a picture of what was occurring outside emerged from the shadows. He noticed that Sakura was staring up at him with wide, terrified eyes. What the devil was going on? He also noticed the man she was bending over. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a gleam. When he realized he had his sword in his hand, his breath caught in his throat. And he was going to shove it into Sakura's skull. Outside, Sakura witnessed the flash of her life before her eyes, and it was clear that Naruto had no intention of stopping. She closed her eyes tightly and bided her time until death. However, Sakura dared to open an eye after a few moments of painlessness and silence, and it was quite a sight. Her attention was drawn to the tiny, delicate snowflakes that were falling from the sky, even though Naruto was standing in front of her with his eyes back to their typical glistening sapphire. Since Konoha was in the land of fire, they never experienced snowfall at home, so she had hardly ever seen it. She saw the white stuff only on their family vacations, never anywhere else. Naruto let out a sound of surprise, and Sakura turned to face her comrade, grinning subtly at his amazement. Abruptly, however, a sensation of warmth spread across her chest. That's when she realized. Naruto. Oh my god, she exclaimed violently. She hadn't noticed the 3-foot long blade protruding from Naruto's stomach because she had been preoccupied with the snow falling. His blood dripping on her chest and blending with her red kimono had been the source of the warm feeling. The blonde gave the staring girl a small smirk before slipping to the right and separating from the two. His stomach burned with pain as the sword moved in his flesh, and he grimaced as he moved. In an instant, Sakura scurried off the ground and was beside Naruto, her gaze fixed on the weapon piercing his body. She gasped, "Wah! What happened?" Before the pinkette could protest, Naruto put his hand on the hilt and withdrew the blade from his stomach, leaving the sword covered in a thin layer of blood from the tip to the handguard. The metal clattered noisily against the ground as his weapon slid out of his grasp. He let out a groan, his face ghostly white. "I couldn't stop, you were about to be killed." Breathing slowly and shudderingly, he fell to the ground, landing abruptly in a sitting position. With his elbows resting on his kneecaps and his head hung low, he drew his knees closer to his body. With physical difficulty, he let out a deep sigh and closed his eyes, concentrating on maintaining consciousness. Sakura crouched beside him and gently touched his side, making Naruto flinch despite the gentle touch. As she pushed up his t-shirt and experienced a faint wash over her, the medic bit her lip. The actual size of the hole was obscured by smeared patches of blood, but it wasn't very large. She could see that the sword had torn right through his body, leaving another huge hole on his back, just to the right of his spine. He wouldn't last long if he continued to lose the red fluid at this rate. It was still bleeding heavily and didn't appear to be slowing down. Sakura's hand began to glow a gentle green as she felt her chakra surge through her body. To her astonishment, however, Naruto cried out in agony the moment the healing power touched his flesh. The pinkette drew back rapidly, worry shining in her jade eyes. She asked anxiously, "What's wrong? What happened?" Naruto let out a grunt. He put his arm around his midsection and said in a strained voice, "Something's up, your chakra hurts." Sakura's brow furrowed in perplexity. She stared at her hand in amazement and whispered, "But I was trying to heal you, that's impossible." With a sigh, Naruto shook his head, his eyes as bewildered as hers. As he jogged up to the two genin, Kakashi inquired, "Is everyone alright?" He examined Sakura, felt his heart rate slow, and saw no injuries on her skin. His heart almost leapt out of his chest as he turned to face the blonde. There was a sharp hole in the middle of his stomach, and blood was dripping out of it. "Oh no." Sakura reported in a trembling voice, hoping her sensei would know what to do. "I tried to heal him, Kakashi Sensei, but he said it hurt and I'm afraid to try it again." With a raised eyebrow, Kakashi turned back to Naruto, who merely gave him a slight smirk. He said simply, "Sakura, I want you to do it again, just as you did before." The order caused Sakura to flinch a little. She answered, "But, what if it hurts him again?" Kakashi gave nod. He replied, "That's exactly what I'm hoping to see." Even though he knew what was hurting him, he wanted to be sure and wanted to see how the blonde would react. Sakura charged up her hand once more, approaching the wound, but she could only obey. She glanced at her friend with the cerulean eyes, her expression questioning, just as her hand was inches away from touching. All he could do was nod. He responded to her silent query by saying, "It's okay." Sakura obeyed, pressing her glowing hand gently to his stomach while holding her breath in her lungs. A red spark shot out of the hole and spread throughout the boy's body as soon as the healing chakra even touched his stomach. As the dazzling energy tore through his head, through his bones, through every fiber of his being, he screamed in agony. As the red sparks wrapped themselves around the teen's body in the rough shape of a fox, complete with a tail and two long ears, Sakura pulled away without hurrying, her hand flying to her mouth before they dispersed in a whirl of power and wound up into the clouds. With weak breathing, Naruto slumped onto his knees for support. His eyes were vulnerable and dim as he looked up. He said, taking deep breaths, "Let's never do that again." Sakura gave a quick nod. Shivering from the demonic cry he had just let out when he had been shocked, she shivered and said, "Deal." "Excuse me, but if you ladies are done talking, a little help would be great," a voice said. When the three turned around, they saw Zabuza fending off over a dozen men by himself while using trembling arms to keep them off his body. They were unaware that he had entered a brawl. The first to move was Naruto, who heaved himself to his feet with a painful sigh and stretched as high as he could without hurting himself anymore. Sakura leapt up and squeezed her body beneath his arm as he grunted and slid slightly towards the ground. He gave her a tiny, sincere smile as he said, "Thanks." The genuine emotion in his face made Sakura's heart skip a beat, and she noticed a slight flush come over her face. She muttered, "No problem," as she quickly looked down at the floor and concentrated on leading the two of them to the bridge's railing. However, the blonde stopped when he saw that Kakashi was running into the fight while they were gradually moving away from it. He nodded his head over his shoulder at the ensuing altercation and said simply, "Sakura, wrong way." Sakura gave a dismissive shake of her head. She responded sharply, feeling suddenly protective of the boy's safety. "Not gonna happen. There is no way I am letting you jump into that." With a childish whine, Naruto managed to make Sakura's worried features smile. He screamed, pretending to be 5 years old once more, "Come on, Mom." He stopped abruptly, his eyes wide and far away. Sakura felt a wave of panic come over her as she turned to face her friend. Was he having problems breathing? "Mom," he sighed, groaning softly and closing his eyes. Sakura's brow furrowed in perplexity. "What about your mom, Naruto?" she inquired, perplexed as to why he had reacted in this way to such a trivial topic. He let out a sigh, and his sapphire eyes were filled with sorrow as he took his hand away. "I just had a flashback. It was a while ago. It was a little boy, lost in the park." The sun had set a while ago and his mother was nowhere to be seen. He was crying, scared, alone. I was about to walk out from my hiding place and comfort him. But then his mom must have heard him crying. She came for him. She took him in her arms and hugged him close. She told him it was okay, that he was safe now, that he was home. Sakura was still perplexed as to how this related to him. Naruto's heart sank as he saw the bewilderment on her face and sighed. He had been naive to believe that someone would be sympathetic to his loneliness, pain, and loneliness. After a moment, he sighed, "Never mind." Naruto turned back to the battle and withdrew from her supporting figure. Sakura started to speak to stop him, but he interrupted her. "Sakura, you can't stop me from doing this." Before anyone could blink, Naruto was delivering a sharp roundhouse kick to Gado's face as he jolted forward with unfathomable speed. The con artist stumbled back and tried to regain his balance, holding his face with his hand, the glass covering his eyes gone, and a tiny drop of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. He growled, "I'm going to kill you." Naruto frowned. He growled back, "I'd like to see you try." Gado snapped his fingers and scowled. He said, "Attack him." He stood idly by with his cane, waiting for his thugs to comply, but Naruto grinned after a few seconds. "Well, that's strange." He crossed his arms over his chest and said, "I'm still breathing." Gado furrowed his brow. "Attack!" he screamed, trying to stop himself from snapping his fingers, but nothing happened. Gado was furious and turned to give his men a world of agony, but he saw that two Junin shinobi were already delivering it, easily thrashing their asses to the ground. Gado clenched his jaw and whipped his cane out in front of his body defensively, holding it as one would hold a sword. Naruto sang, slipping as far into a stance as he could manage. Well, it looks like it's just you and me." Gado answered, "Hit me with your best shot." Sakura moaned, knowing that the little she did about the blonde would push it too far. Pushing the fine line past the boundary Kami was graciously allowing, while she watched Naruto and Gado leap into a brawl, each fighting with their own cripple. Her emerald eyes strayed to her sensei and their former target, who were now cooperating. Despite the fact that Gado had arrived with more than 500 men, the two had already reduced the number of people to about 20, leaving only the more powerful ones. With Kakashi taking care of the lackeys and Naruto tending to the leader, Sakura felt worthless and could only observe. She had been doing that a lot lately, and she was beginning to grow weary of it. Her heart pounded and her palms began to perspire when she heard a moan behind her. "Back up. Since Kakashi Sensei and Naruto are busy, I should be able to help." Holding her weapon at attention across her chest, Sakura whipped around and slid into a stance in the same motion, swiping a kunai out of the holster at her thigh. Sakura gasped as her hand flew to her mouth, her defenses crumbling almost instantly as she threw aside the miniature knife, the metal screeching across the pavement as it skidded away, and she rushed over to the Uchiha's side, wedging her body under his arm just as his knees gave out. Sasuke shot her a dark glare, his hand gripping his shoulder tightly, his knuckles a visible ghostly white, the raw puncture holes glowed on his pale skin and his figure shook dangerously, promising to fail. Sakura nearly fell to the ground as Sasuke's weight slammed onto her shoulder in an instant, but she caught herself just in time, the bottom of her dress grazing the floor. "You shouldn't be moving around just yet, Sasuke." The teenager grunted as he was slowly placed on the ground, pressing his back against the cool metal poles behind him, trying to calm his ragged breathing, the moist air filling his lungs unevenly. Sakura reprimanded him and assisted him in limping over to the guard rail. Sakura examined him, mentally mapping his condition. Sakura furrowed her brow. That was impossible. No one, not even Sasuke Uchiha, could heal that quickly. The angry red dots covering his body were still unsightly blazing fires on his naturally light skin, but they appeared slightly glazed, as if they had been healing for a few days already. Perhaps it's a trait of the Uchiha family. Well, that must be it. "Let me fight." Sakura sighed. The two boys on her team were so similar that they couldn't bear to be separated from a fight. Sasuke gasped, struggling to stand, but found his legs abnormally heavy. "You can't even walk, so you're not in a fit state to fight." Sakura ordered no backtalk, saying, "You're going to sit here and wait until I can at least get into someone's satisfactory position." Sasuke sighed and turned his head away from his teammate, allowing his eyes to wander to the two battles that took place on the same field. Even though they were obviously outnumbered, Kakashi and Zabuza were holding their own well. The ground was covered in bodies. Many of them still alive, though Sasuke couldn't tell, and there were still a good number of them remaining. They must be the most proficient of the horde that had been placed upon them, he realized. Naruto's side had turned red, soaked with blood that was seeping from some wound she must have acquired, though Sasuke didn't know what it was. Naruto and Gato were still only blocking the blows the other threw at them, both of them at a serious medical disadvantage. Gato's limp had become more and more exaggerated, until his body was tilted noticeably toward his cripple. Sasuke couldn't help but smirk briefly. The hotshot was struggling. Whatever became of Naruto? Sakura grimaced as she ran her softly green glowing hand over his shoulder, feeling the muscles beneath his skin sew back together. "What happened to the blonde?" Sasuke asked. Sakura began softly, reliving the scene in her mind. "Well, after one of Gato's thugs killed Haku, Naruto got really mad." Sasuke's eyes widened. The child was already dead. It appeared that his retaliation for the needle wounds spotting his figure was now out of reach. "I'm not entirely sure what happened, so I can't really explain it." However, his chakra sense surged to unthinkable heights and his eyes turned red. With a sudden burst of speed, he attacked the swordsman, and before any of us knew it, he was going to kill him. I've never witnessed someone so ruthless and uncontrollable, Sasuke, and it was terrifying. As the image of his eyes flashed through her mind, Sakura whispered, "It wasn't the Naruto we, well, sorta know." And Naruto was many things, but killer didn't seem to be on the list, so Sasuke asked, "Why and how can someone like him be bloodthirsty?" Naruto pulled out his sword and was ready to drive it through him after claiming he wanted to give him a taste of his own medicine. Sasuke's eyes widened as Sakura continued, "So I jumped in the way." Her voice was quiet and hoarse, barely audible. Why would Sakura interfere with a fight, especially one involving an overpowered Naruto? It was definitely not like her at all. Things were changing so quickly. Naruto was so unique, so evil. Even when I placed my body between him and the swordsman, he continued. He was actually going to kill me, but I noticed a change as the snow began to fall. His swing continued, but I noticed a flash of panic in his eyes, someone who would stop at nothing to prevent an event from happening. I believe I caught a glimpse of Naruto's true nature. Sasuke listened carefully, his face displaying confusion. Usually, stories like these would bore him, sounding like a teenage girl's love story, but this time, it was real. The next thing I knew, he redirected the blade and stabbed himself in the side. "To save me," Sakura said, her eyes misting. "And the weird power, well, that sounded intriguing as well." Naruto gritted his teeth. This battle was going nowhere because of his disability. Sometimes he thought it would be better if ninja had been born without hearts. Then they could slaughter anyone they needed to accomplish their goal. Naruto blocked another blow from Gato, the man's walking stick ringing dully on the gleaming metal of his blade. How could he think that way? Even Itachi would scowl in dismay at having even the slightest faith in such extremes. Naruto shook that thought away. Gato saw Naruto falter in his defenses and gave him a smug smile, which created an opening. The thug leader then struck the open wound on his side with his cane. When dark red sparks danced over the teen's body, Naruto saw Gato freeze, his victorious expression giving way to one of horror as a sharp pain shot up his side and a burning pang burst from his stomach. The hole began to spit out blood, the already soaked material becoming heavy and sticking to his side. Then the excruciating pain struck. Sasuke, Almost done, Sakura said, sensing Sasuke's body trembling for action beneath the healing glow. Then, abruptly, a blood-splitting scream broke the battle sounds, and the air became more intense with a suffocating amount of power, with the temperature noticeably dropping. Unfortunately, that yell sounded familiar, and Sakura gasped. Sakura's eyes widened and she whispered, "Naruto." Her hands instantly died down completely as her gaze shifted away from the Uchiha, and when Sasuke followed her trail of sight, the scene he saw astounded him beyond belief. Gato was standing stiff, his defenses tight, and his face was one of fear and bewilderment, and he had good reason for it. The battle between the two had completely ceased, and Naruto's sword was lying forgotten on the ground. Naruto was only a few feet away, clutching the sides of his head, his fingers digging viciously into his hair, his eyes screwed shut, his teeth clamped tightly together, and he was hunched over a little, the air around him flaring like a loose animal form. Jagged lengths of crimson sparks crawling across his body, clearly causing some sort of pain. Then they suddenly intensified and Naruto cried out again, unable to contain the agony he was experiencing at the moment. "What's happening?" Sasuke questioned, frantically looking from Sakura to Naruto, but his pink-haired teammate was unable to respond, so she was forced to watch while nervously biting her lip. What would we be able to do if he returned to that unmanageable state? Would we have to kill him? However, I do not wish to lose him. Sakura's heart stopped. Caring about someone else's life was quite normal, especially if that person was a friend and teammate, but why did it feel like something more? This was no time to dwell on it, so Sakura shook the thought away. Sasuke watched as Gato's face twisted into a smile as Sakura went through her moment of shock, his glasses gleaming dangerously, and he pulled at his cane, causing part of the wood to slide away, exposing a glimmering blade that took up about 2/3 of its length. The small man approached the teenager, who was on his knees with his head still in his hands and sparks flying wildly. Raising his weapon, Gato prepared to slit the boy's head in two. It was strange. He wasn't heartless, of course. He felt a panic when someone was going to be killed in front of him. But this was different, more personal. Sasuke's eyes widened. Naruto was going to die. The Uchiha didn't know why, but he felt a sharp pain hit his heart when he realized these words. Despite his intense hatred for the blonde, the thought of Naruto's death caused him to feel a great sense of loss and fear, and it made his heart race in his ears and his palms begin to perspire. Sasuke concluded that he would never tolerate his death, regardless of how much he hated him. The pinkette was startled out of her work when the boy with the raven hair clambered up from his spot on the cement. Sakura began to say, "Sasuke, what are you?" but was cut off when the Uchiha ran off, disappearing across the bridge in a flash. Naruto. His vision was washed away in a wave of red, and all he could hear was the frantic, irregular beating of his heart. The pain didn't go away. Instead, it only got worse, progressing from a splitting pain to a deathly agony. He heard a faint sound in the distance, like the fact that all of the weapon clashes had stopped, which made him wonder what was going on outside. Naruto tried to raise his arms in defense, thinking that Gato or one of his goons was going to finish him permanently, but the blow never came. Instead, he heard someone grunt and a crash that sounded like a body smashed into the pavement. Suddenly, a single sound broke through the crimson shroud. The determined yell of an attacker. When Naruto's senses returned, he was shocked to see a figure standing over him, silhouetted by the weak sun, their chest rising heavily with anger. Colors came rushing back in a blast of white light, the pain fading, or at least shifting into the back of his mind. Sasuke. As his eyes attempted to acclimate to the light, Naruto blinking quickly, he whispered in bewilderment. With his eyes fixed on his target, the Uchiha snarled, "Are you okay?" The boy with the charcoal eyes sighed, as if in relief, and Naruto nodded in return. He growled and said, "Now there's you." Gato was leaning on his knees, picking himself up off the ground, with a dark red stain on the side of his face and a trickle of blood coming from his mouth, when Naruto followed the shinobi's line of sight. He must have been quite tough because he flew far away from here, and based on that mark. Naruto was shocked. What the hell had happened in his seconds of blackout? Gato screamed as Sasuke took a step forward, falling back on his ass and scurrying backwards, his eyes wide with fear. Hadn't it been seconds? What happened? Sasuke. What's happening? Sasuke sneered as Naruto asked, for the first time in a long time, completely lost. Did you get seriously hurt by that minor electrocution? The boy looked down at his teammate and jeered. Naruto's eyes widened at roughly the same moment that Sasuke's did. "Sasuke," murmured Naruto. As Sasuke breathed, "Naruto." Both were unable to do anything but stare at each other during the brief silence. "Your eyes. Dude! Sasuke's brow furrowed and Naruto tilted his head sideways as the two shouted together, pointing in opposite directions. How about them? Wondering what the shinobi might be discussing, Sasuke asked. Naruto dug into his star pouch and produced a small mirror, which he then gave to the Uchiha. Sasuke grinned and suppressed a laugh. You always have a mirror in your back pocket? Naruto frowned as he laughed, his little smile expanding into a broad grin. Naruto rolled his eyes and growled back, I use it for surveillance, now look at your damn eyes already. Sasuke smirked, looked into the mirror, then jumped back and let out a little cry of surprise. His eyes had changed from the charcoal black they had been this morning to a bright red that glowed against his dark hair and pale skin, and each eye had a single black mark that resembled a coma swimming around its pupil. Naruto smirked slightly as Sasuke whispered, his eyes widening in realization, Sharingan, this was the fabled eye, the Uchiha legacy, and now it was his. The Uchiha gave him a little smile when he said, sarcastically, congrats, you're moving up in the world. Sasuke pushed his eyes away from his newfound power and threw the tiny mirror into Naruto's lap while crossing his arms over his chest. The raven-haired teenager's response, your turn Goldilocks, elicited an eye roll from his teammate, and Naruto snatched the small object off the bridge before noticing a somewhat familiar reflection below. Naruto's eyes narrowed, focusing a bit more, and he saw himself in them, but he also saw something different, something he'd never seen in the cerulean orbs. His eyes had changed, morphing into a blood red, with pupils slit like a cat or a fox. It had the insane appearance of an animal that had been imprisoned for too long and was desperate for freedom, destroying everything and everyone to obtain it. Let go, let go, let go. With a groan and a gentle touch to his temple, Naruto's thoughts were whispering softly. Unleash, Naruto muttered to himself, unsure of the meaning of the voice. Hey, how are you? I asked. Naruto shook his head, removing the strange voice and the emotion behind the eyes from his mind. The blonde looked up at the raven-haired boy and saw that his eyes had returned to their typical smoky black appearance. Sasuke asked again, leaning down to his teammate. Yeah, I'm fine. Naruto nodded slightly and took Sasuke's hand to help him stand up. He grunted and got back up, though his side ached as the blood returned to his legs. Thanks, the teenager said, dismissing himself. Sasuke nodded. As he walked back towards Sakura, he panned, don't mention it, Little Red Riding Hood. His wounds were beginning to slow him down. Sasuke stopped in mid-step and turned halfway around, giving Naruto the finger. Whatever, Snow White. Naruto responded with a smooth, soft sneer. Naruto let out a sigh and started to move forward, but he kept thinking he was forgetting something. The man's eyes met the man's gleaming glasses, and judging by his frown, he wasn't pleased. His hand shot to his holster, and he drew a kunai from his pouch, spinning around and deflecting the blow that Gato had thrown at him. Naruto gritted his teeth as he felt the strain on his sides split his thinly covered wound open again. You're gonna pay for all the pain you've put me through, kid. He barked, applying more pressure to the teen's defenses. With his eyes darting to his teammates to make sure they were out of earshot, Naruto whispered, you're just lucky I'm fighting with restrictions. Gato sneered. The blonde clenched his jaw, saying, I'm sure that's the reason. He jumped back to avoid a sweep kick that Naruto had secretly thrown at him. Damn Itachi and the limit. If he'd been able to fight like he'd been trained to do. Naruto spun around and looked at the two genin by the bridge's edge. Tag squad. Sasuke shrugged and tore several shuriken from his star pouch as the blue-eyed shinobi raised an eyebrow at the Uchiha. Naruto smirked as he ran up to join his comrade in battle, saying, be interesting to see what it's like to fight together instead of each other for a change. Gato's confidence faltered as Sasuke took his place, and they both slid into a stance. With a frown in return, the teenager said, as I remember it, we fought once, and I won. Before he could move, Gato was slammed hard against the cement, causing him to groan as he lifted his face off the ground and looked up into Sasuke's dark, menacing eyes. Gato used this opportunity to give a subtle signal to one of the remaining thugs, who nodded his response and disappeared into the mist. With a quick smirk, the Uchiha reached down and grabbed the back of the man's collar, pulling him up with some strain and then grunting with effort, heaving him into the air. We don't like to be ignored. Naruto launched himself off Sasuke's back and twisted to kick him dead center in the back, sending him higher as the leader flailed in midair. The blonde followed him into the sky, sparring blow after blow before vanishing as Gato frantically whacked his stick around. A cloud of dust exploded from the crater the impact created, and for a moment, the opponent did not move. Naruto landed next to Sasuke and placed a firm hand on his hilt. Ready to make a move. Naruto faded in above him and spun around, landing a fluid roundhouse kick to his stomach. Gato cried out as he spiraled to the ground, smashing into the surface with a bone. Crunching crash. Gato flopped down on the edge of the crater, breathing heavily as his chest rose raggedly as he struggled onto his elbows and attempted to claw his way up onto flatter land, his face scrunching up in pain as he stretched his back. The blonde drew his blade with a single swoop, deftly turning the point around to face the man's neck, holding it hovering under his Adam's apple, the sharpened tip biting into his skin. A pinpoint of blood oozing out, and Gato bit his lip while keeping his eyes on the sword after Naruto and Sasuke exchanged glances and nodded at the same time. This is over. Naruto snarled and narrowed his eyes, saying, "You're no longer a threat to this village and its people." With a simple flick of his wrist, the world would be permanently free of this man. A moment later, the wind sped up, the water droplets floating in mid-air as if frozen, and Zabuza was crouched beside them, on Gato's right side, slashing out with his hand and grabbing the blade, ignoring the edge digging into his fingers, flicking the weapon away from Gato's throat, then grabbing the fallen man's shoulder and fleeing, taking the leader with him. Naruto's eyes widened and he spun around, frantically looking for his escaped victim. As Sasuke searched the mist for their targets, his newly acquired Sharingan activated, he spat, "Traitor." He paused and growled under his breath, pointing a finger away from the brawl Kakashi was still engaged in, reporting, "They're over there." Naruto sighed and sheathed his blade, trailing the Uchiha. Gato smirked as he brushed himself off, attempting to remove the pieces of rubble that were sticking to his clothes, and the two landed on the bridge a short distance from the other warriors, the sounds of battle muffled. Gato, who seemed to have been anticipating the rescue the entire time, said, "So I see you've returned to our side, smart choice." Zabuza started to say something, but was cut off by a furious yell. The two turned just in time to see Sasuke leap out from the white cloak, and the Konoha ninja landed heavily on his feet with blood-red eyes blazing and a kunai held in an offensive position. The smoky mist parted again, revealing Naruto, who appeared slightly relieved to have found them. He skidded to a stop at Sasuke's side, his darkened eyes on Zabuza. "Prepare to die where you stand, both of you," the teen said, his teeth gritted in rage. The blonde's eyes probed the depths of Zabuza's cold ones, and although the mist shinobi would never acknowledge it, the child's gaze unnerved him. "Hold on, Sasuke," he whispered, shifting his arm in front of the Uchiha to stop him from moving. "I simply don't understand how Haku could have such a strong sense of loyalty when his master has none. Now, tell me something. Come on, what are you, a jellyfish with no backbone? I know you're a nuke.nin and everything." With a low, menacing voice, he asked, "Just because the odds aren't looking so great doesn't mean you turn your back on your comrades." Sasuke scoffed. His teammate frowned as he muttered under his breath, "This coming from you." The Uchiha fell silent as he shot back, "There's a difference between impassive and traitorous." Zabuza sighed and shook his head. "Each and every one of you shinobi views a fight as a one-way ticket." As Naruto and Sasuke ducked lower into a stance, prepared to attack the traitor, the Mist Ninja said, "But, for once, I agree with the laws of the shinobi. Either you win or you die, and you never see there as being a different solution." To the surprise of the three in attendance, Zabuza added, "There are no changing sides in a battle like this." Naruto lowered his hands and slid out of his position. Then, with the question left open, ended, he said, "Now it was Zabuza's turn to grimace." The dark, lanky man growled, his deathly gaze flickering towards the small man. "I've realized that the only one I ever really cared for in this world was my apprentice Haku, and since Gato took him away from me, and everyone else in the world, I want to be the one to send him to his eternal resting place." Gato backpedaled under his glare, a suffocating sense of dread washing over him. Sasuke laughed and put his weapon back in his holster as Naruto's face lit up with an almost smile. The next time he blinked, Sasuke's eyes returned to normal. "Well then, have fun." Zabuza nodded, and then quickly yanked his blade off his back and swung. Inari realized that he couldn't just sit around and wait for the shinobi to return successfully, possibly, just a few minutes after Naruto had left and his mother had come to. He could no longer afford to sit on the sidelines, he had to do something. Disregarding his mother's entreaties, he fastened a bunch of arrows to his back and grabbed his crossbow before sprinting in the direction of the town, his heart and mind full of resolve. For a very long time, he had lost all hope for this town. Heroes, in his opinion, would never exist. However, everything changed after his conversation with Kakashi and the events involving Naruto. A flashback: the genin and their sensei emerged from the tree line, returning from their daily training session, as Inari watched from around the corner of his house. With his head hanging and his eyes fixed on the ground, Naruto was the first to step out into the sunlight with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Sakura hurried to join the blonde as the other two followed closely behind. Sakura smiled softly and said, "Hey Naruto, you did an amazing job today in training." In response, the blonde merely shrugged and muttered, "Thanks." Inari caught the boy by the arm as the pinkette sighed and bit her lip. Naruto briefly locked eyes with her before quickly averting his gaze and lowering himself back to the floor. She asked, closely observing his response, "What's been wrong lately, Naruto? Something's bothering you. I can tell." Naruto looked up without emotion. He turned away, whispering, "Nothing, I just want to be left alone. I always want to be left alone." As he walked sluggishly in the direction of the house, Sakura's hand fell from his arm. Sakura halted the boy in his tracks by whispering, "I see it in your eyes." Confusion pierced the blank as he turned. "The pain, I mean. Though you say those things, I can see you don't really mean it, you don't want it," she continued. After years of training to be emotionless, Naruto clenched his jaw. How on earth was he unable to spend a few weeks with these people? What did he find so irresistible about them? The blonde said, "I'm sorry, you must have imagined it." Before Sakura could respond, he entered the house, and the door quietly closed behind him. The kunoichi gave a sorrowful sigh. She followed him into the house, breathing, "Maybe he's right, maybe this is a lost cause." Only a few moments later, Sasuke and Kakashi emerged, whispering to each other. Kakashi paused as they got closer to the house and looked to where Inari was hiding. "Go on inside, Sasuke, I've got something I need to do," he said. After responding with a nod, the Uchiha vanished through the door. Kakashi took a step toward Inari and then abruptly disappeared, showing up directly beside the young boy who was crouching on the ground. The masked man leaned down beside the child with the raven hair and laughed. "Spying, are we?" Inari let out a startled cry and collapsed against the house's side, his eyes wide. With his heart racing from the shock, he questioned, "How did you know I was here?" Kakashi smiled with one eye, ruffled the boy's hair and said, "Remember, I'm a trained shinobi?" With a gentle smile, Inari's mind was suddenly filled with a thought. He asked, "Kakashi Sensei, what can you tell me about Naruto?" Kakashi, who was seated on the ground opposite Inari, arched an eyebrow. "What for?" inquired the Konoha ninja. With his eyes on his feet, Inari shrugged his response. He said softly, embarrassed to even ask, "Just want to know." Kakashi grinned subtly, not seeing much of a problem with it. To Inari's surprise, Kakashi began, "Well, we don't know much about Naruto really." He raised his head and listened carefully to what the Junin had to say. "He ran away from the village when he was about 5 years old for reasons we don't yet understand. A lot of people forgot about him. They actually thought he was dead, as they didn't know that he had run away." Kakashi clarified. "To be forgotten, to be regarded as dead by his village's residents?" Inari's eyes widened. In his village, everyone treated one another like family. What made it so different? Naruto survived all on his own for 8 years, training on the road with whatever ninja he met up with. When he finally did return home, he jumped right into the graduating class, which was taking its final exams the very next day. Even though Inari suspected he already knew the answer, he asked, "Let me guess, he passed?" Kakashi gave nod. Best in the class, though they didn't let them know that. It would have caused quite an upset. Anyway, he was put on my team and we trained together. I began to notice that he has strength I've never seen in someone so young before. It's truly astounding. You wouldn't believe it unless you saw it really. The shinobi replied. Inari cocked his head, perplexed. But how could someone be that good? Who taught him all that stuff? Asked he. Kakashi gave a shrug. With his thoughts returning to that topic, the man answered, "No one knows. There's a lot he's kept to himself." Inari asked out loud, "Why did Naruto run away in the first place?" Seeing the question in Inari's eyes, Kakashi sighed and decided to give him a half-truth. Ever since the day Naruto was born, people have treated him differently because of an event that took place the day he was born. It was decreed by the leader of our village, the Hokage, that we were never to mention it again, but to put it in simple words, Naruto saved the village from a terrible monster. A monster? Inari was shocked. What sort of creature? In order to hear what their sensei had to say, the boy suppressed his emotions. Naruto was supposed to be seen as a hero, but instead, people saw him as the monster himself, and well, they didn't react very well. They always treated him horribly, attacking him in the streets, calling him names. Horrified that the boy's parents hadn't attempted to stop any of that before he fled, Inari interrupted. Why didn't his parents do anything about it? Kakashi's eyes lost their gleam as they became sad. With a dejected tone, Kakashi muttered, Naruto's been an orphan since birth. His parents died shortly after he was born. And he doesn't have any other known living relatives. Inari considered this. Despite losing a loved one, he still had his mother, his grandfather, and the entire village on his side. He therefore couldn't fathom what it must have been like for Naruto to live that way, despised and alone. I don't think I could have lived on day like that, the child with the charcoal hair said, dejectedly. That must have been horrible. Kakashi gave nod. More to himself than anyone else, Kakashi muttered, it is quite hard to put yourself in that position. And it makes it even more amazing that he managed to do it for so long without a crack. Inari asked, do you think that's how Naruto got so strong? You know, his anger and sadness. Kakashi thought about this. It sounded like a plausible concept. If only Naruto were a bit easier to read, it would also make sense. When Inari saw Kakashi's expression of frustration, she instantly questioned why. What's wrong? Inquired the boy. Kakashi let out a deep sigh. He's just hard to figure out. One day, he's all happy and open, but then he'll be bored the next. I don't know why, but it's like he can't make up his mind whether to be a statue or to be a regular kid. He rants. As he concluded his remarks, he questioned why he was telling Inari all of this. It wasn't the best course of action he had ever taken. He always thought best when discussing it aloud, though. The Hokage had told them that it was the reason he had been a good Anbu captain. Recalling the incident that had occurred just a few days prior, Inari muttered, do you think it has something to do with the attack in the shed? Kakashi winced, remembering that night with a sudden sharpness. Even though he had witnessed many things over the years, he had never seen anyone look so shaken. Possibly, he has been the quietest since then, but I guess we'll never know if he doesn't open his mouth. The shinobi exhaled. Inari gave a nod. The child wondered who had been lurking around his house and asked, do we even know who attacked him? Kakashi gave a dejected shake of his head. He ran a hand through his gravity, defying hair in dismay, and said, no, Naruto either doesn't know or won't tell us. But whoever it was instilled a fear in him, enough to leave him the shell of the boy he was becoming. I just hope that Sasuke, Sakura and Naruto find a way to bond while they're guarding the bridge tomorrow morning. Inari's gaze widened. He questioned sharply, are they done with training? Was being a shinobi really that easy? Kakashi laughed. The Junin grinned, delighted at the young boy's interest, and said, for this week, yes, they're done. But they still have a lot to learn and I don't want to overload their minds too quickly. Thinking he had addressed every question, he sighed and got up to start walking back towards the house. A voice that was almost whispered followed him, asking, why does Naruto believe in heroes? Kakashi came to a halt and faced Inari again, who was looking at him blankly. If his life has been that horrible so far, how is it that he can believe that there's good? The question buzzed in Kakashi's mind as he lowered his gaze. He had never considered it himself, but it was also a great wonder. With a past like that, how could anyone think there was still hope for the world? I don't know. There seems a lot to be unsure about, but I have noticed this. Naruto has a heart hidden beneath his cold demeanor. And though he doesn't want anyone to know, he cares, especially for the underdog. Because he had such a rough childhood, he must want to protect everyone from a harshness he had to learn early. I guess it's because he doesn't want them to live through the same harshness. Inari agreed with that later that evening as he went to sleep. Final flashback. Instead of waiting for the shinobi and his grandfather to return alive, he had to assist in saving this town. Naruto could sacrifice everything for his home if the ostensibly heartless and gloomy character was willing to risk his life for a village he didn't even know. This was Inari's thought as he began pounding on the doors of every person in the port and yelling for them to accompany him to the bridge so they could stand and fight alongside him. However, no one answered the door, so Inari had to leave without wasting any more time. He had quickly traversed most of the village, and not a single person had responded to his call. He ran up the stairs of his aunt and uncle's house, which he knew well. The frame of the heavy, thick door creaked as he hammered against it. As Inari ran across the distances, his chest burned. Auntie, uncle, please, come with me to the bridge. Come and fight with me to save our town, he cried. Silence reigned for a moment, and Inari started to think they might even be home. A hoarse call, however, came from just behind the rigid wood. His uncle's voice was lifeless and despairing as he whispered, go home, Inari. There's nothing we can do. Even though he knew his uncle couldn't see him, Inari gave a fierce shake of his head. He urged, his resolve flaming, "Of course there is. We stand and fight. We don't have to let them walk all over us anymore. This is our port and we can take it back if we fight together." For a short while, his uncle remained silent once more, simply leaning against the door and listening to his nephew's ragged breathing. The older man sighed in a dejected tone. "There's been enough bloodshed over this to last for eternity. Why should we throw away someone else's life for a hopeless cause? It's just not worth it." Inari clenched his jaw. He had anticipated that people would be ready to escape Gado's grasp. Given how close they were, why are they now retreating? The child responded, "But if no one fights, how can we ever expect to be free again?" His anxiety increased as he realized that if his own family wouldn't assist, what hope did the rest of the village have that they would? His uncle paused and said, "The hope for freedom died a long time ago." With hesitation, he then added, "Along with your father." Inari's eyes widened and began to well up with tears as he gasped. Shakily, he wiped away the water and the wave of sadness that was crashing against him while biting his lip. His uncle broke the silence created by his final words by breathing, "The only ultimatum is to survive now." Inari took a deep, purifying breath and pushed the gloomy thoughts that were dragging at his head away. "My dad sacrificed his life to see the wave free and prosperous again, and that's exactly what those shinobi are doing right now. They're putting their lives on the line for us, for a town they don't even know. My father and them have something in common. They're heroes, and I'm not going to sit around while my father's death goes to waste. And I'm certainly not letting Gado add those ninja to his list of victims. If no one will help me, then I'll fight alone." Inari screamed, bouncing around on his foot as he jumped down the stairs. He heard his aunt shouting after him, begging him to stop, as he ran to the bridge and the first few drops of rain began to fall. However, he simply continued to run. "Grandpa, wait for me. Naruto, I'm coming." Bridge. Zabuza threw his first swing at Gado, who ducked. Everyone in the vicinity of the dark mist shinobi could hear the blade slicing through the air. An escape boat would undoubtedly be waiting below as the crippled thug rolled away, easing himself into a stand with his good leg, and headed for the bridge's edge. With a low, menacing growl rumbling from the depths of his throat, Zabuza gritted his teeth. He growled and jumped after him, saying, "Not getting away from me that easily." He darted directly in front of him, delivering another blow to the leader with his present momentum. The blow again swung uselessly above Gado's head, causing him to drop to his knees. Gado dodged the near miss when Zabuza cleaved it downward with a tuck and roll. The blade nipped his arm, causing blood to instantly appear in a line that ran from his shoulder to just beneath his elbow. Zabuza slammed a horizontal slice at Gado, threatening to rip his head off, and ripped his enormous sword from the tight rut he had driven it into. In order to avoid missing a lethal shot, the man fell to the ground. He scrambled back onto his feet and started running again, letting out a cry. Targeting Gado's ankles and the back of his foot, the mist shinobi twisted on his heel. He struck him hard, and the man lost his footing and fell to the ground. Zabuza stepped forward, his sword swung menacingly. With a cry of terror, Gado pushed himself away and scooted across the bridge surface in a fruitless attempt to get away. With his dark, glaring eyes staring into Gado's terrified ones, the lanky Rouge towered over him. His eyes narrowed in murderous intentness as his hands tightened around the hilt of his weapon. Zabuza snarled and raised his sword for the last blow, declaring, "It's over." Gado's breath caught in his chest and his eyes widened. He glanced down at his cane, his only hope. His eyes suddenly glowed with memory, and he quickly picked it up. He gently flicked off a little piece of wood, exposing a tiny needle beneath the cover. With a closer look using Sasuke's Sharingan, Naruto and Sasuke discovered that the gleam at the end of Gado's cane was actually a needle, ideal for administering injections. Deactivating his jutsu, Sasuke asked, "What's he going to inject?" As Zabuza raised his blade high, leaving his side exposed and vulnerable, Naruto swiftly retorted, "Whatever it is, it can't be good." Gado saw his opening and smirked quickly. Naruto yelled, "Zabuza, look out," as his voice reverberated over the bridge. Zabuza arched an eyebrow, but Gado leapt forward in a blur and stabbed the shinobi in the side before he could ask a question. A tiny metal button on the side was then pressed by him. Zabuza screamed instantly, retreated, and the needle emerged from his side. A dark violet propel liquid splashed onto the cement from the metal's opening. A few seconds later, the puddle began to sizzle, and a column of hazy smoke rose into the air. The eyes of the two teenagers grew wide. Confused, Sasuke exclaimed, "The hell?" Zabuza cried out in agony once more while gripping his side. Gato picked himself up off the ground with an evil sneer. He approached Zabuza's abandoned sword and kicked the blunt side with a sharp blow. It vanished into the mist after skidding across the bridge. This time, Gato turned his cane around and pushed aside the piece of wood that was hiding his sword. He took hold of the center of the wood that was left and moved toward the squirming shinobi. Naruto chose the quickest option out of the many that raced through his mind. With a shout of, "Zabuza!" the blonde grabbed a kunai from his holster. The knife sailed end over end as he whipped it at the mist ninja. When the man looked up, he saw a shining metal object flying toward him. When he threw up his hand, the metal sank a little bit into his skin and the point lodged itself in his palm. He grunted and withdrew it from his grasp, causing blood to trickle down his arm. With a fierce gleam in his eyes, Gato slashed down, intending to sever Zabuza's left arm at the shoulder. Leaping to the left, the mist ninja flipped over Gato's shoulder and spun around. He then stabbed the man in the back of the neck with the kunai. Gato's eyes widened in shock, horror, and agony as he gasped. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air and his breathing catching in his throat. When he coughed, a stream of blood splattered onto the ground from his mouth. His expression was unreadable as he looked at the two teenagers who were standing a short distance away. Then his eyes grew glassy, and they dimmed. He sagged to one side and then fell all the way over, tumbling over the bridge's edge. When he finally struck, Zabuza heard a loud splash as the man's body fell to the sea below. Sasuke and Naruto sprinted to the mist shinobi's side and peered over its shoulder. At that moment, Naruto became aware that he could see the bottom of the bridge, indicating that the mist was dissipating. Naruto scowled as he turned to face Zabuza. With a suspicious look on her face, the blonde said, "Your jutsu is wearing off, are you okay?" The response was a feeble nod from Zabuza, whose face was white. "Yeah, I'm." More than half a dozen thugs, all armed and dangerous, suddenly surrounded them. Zabuza was buried beneath a pile of muscular men as they launched themselves at him. Sasuke and Naruto leapt at the dog pile in an effort to remove them from Zabuza. However, one of them was pushed off his chest by the mist ninja, exposing his head. He growled and vanished once more, saying, "I can handle this here. Go help your teammates." After exchanging glances, Naruto and Sasuke nodded and took off in the direction that Kakashi had been last seen. Then the rain began to fall. Inari. Now that the rain was really coming down, the little boy was running through the streets while the sheets pounded against him. His vision was somewhat obscured by a light mist that covered the bridge as he stepped onto it for the first time. They must not be that far in because he could already hear the sounds of a battle. He wondered as he ran exactly what he would do when he arrived. Other than getting in the way, what could a boy his age do in a conflict between criminals and shinobi? He couldn't just give up, though. He would come up with something when the time came, but he refused to wait. Inari arrived at the scene of the fight after breaking through a cloud of hazy smoke, and what he saw overwhelmed him. The only defenders on the bridge were encircled by packs of thugs. With dog summons encircling his feet, Kakashi was fighting alone. They would sink their teeth into anything they could get their hands on and lunge at any assailant who came up behind them in the hopes of launching a sneak attack. With just the weapon she carried in her holster and star pouch, Sakura was once more defending Tazuna. She continued to fight after a thug knocked away the small knife she was using. She struck him hard in the face with her fist, causing his nose to bend at an odd angle. Tazuna was even using a big piece of wood to fight off their opponents. It was not very agile, but when it struck hard enough, it delivered a pretty devastating blow. With the help of his Sharingan, Sasuke was dispatching man after man with ease while engaging in some intense hand combat. He had planned to occasionally use one of his specialty jutsu, but he changed his mind because the continual use of his Sharingan was beginning to wear him down. Last but not least was Naruto. He was traveling quickly but delivering few blows, staying close to the periphery of the fight. After a few strikes, the opponent would collapse to the ground, rendered unconscious. He would then go on. However, a gang member swung his arm at him as he was approaching a thug who was going to ambush Sasuke. The man stopped Naruto dead in his tracks by punching him in the middle of his stomach. The force of the impact caused Naruto to double over, sending air rushing out of his lungs. The man trapped him in his iron grip after slamming his foot onto his shoulder. The gangster sneered and withdrew a dagger, saying, "And to make sure you don't get away," he pinned Naruto to the cement by lowering himself and driving the knife through his shoulder. Despite the obvious pain in his eyes, Naruto did not scream. With a broad smile, the man complained, "Why are you still fighting? It's a lost cause. Even though our leader may be dead, we still outnumber you." Naruto clenched his jaw and applied pressure to the man's leg, but it remained stationary. Had his power been zapped by those sparks? Or had he simply lost his advantage? I fight for the underdog and I fight to revive the belief of heroes. The blonde responded, startled by the truth of what he was saying. I'm fighting to prove something to a boy who lost all hope. With a bellow in the open air, the thug towering over him laughed. As he reached behind his back for his next weapon, he growled, the only heroes are dead ones, because they were so foolish as to stand in the way. And you're about to join them. Naruto, however, refused to give him the opportunity. The man was swept off his feet when the blonde swung his foot out. The air rushed out in a whoosh as the thug's body crashed into the ground. Reaching up, Naruto grabbed the dagger's hilt and attempted to remove it from his arm. But it clung to his flesh, refusing to let go. The teenager was left at the mercy of an angry gangster after it had been driven quite deep into the bridge's floor. A thug's enormous wall stood up, his face flushed bright red with rage. He rushed to the struggling teenager and took out a second, longer knife from deep in his pocket. Naruto clenched his jaw and exerted force on the blade embedded in his shoulder, but it remained unyielding. The man swore, bringing the weapon's shining point to rest at the base of Naruto's collarbone. You've got nowhere to go, no one to help you, you're mine now. His only task was to thrust in, and it would be over. However, before he could land the last blow, they heard something whistling through the air, and a moment later, an arrow was slamming into the tall thug's back. The man stumbled forward, tripping over the blonde who was pinned to the ground, and grunted in shock and pain. The lackey fell heavily to the bridge, where it landed in a heap. A tiny arrow, dug well up the shaft, protruded from between his shoulder blade and spine. Naruto looked up and saw something he had never seen before. His eyes widened as he whispered, "It's the kid." With his crossbow in hand and his charcoal eyes fixed on the man who was pushing himself to his knees, Inari stood hidden in a tiny puff of mist. The gangster spun around, looking for his assailant. He looked at Inari and his crossbow and the arrows in his bushel. The same one that was currently buried in his torso. The man growled fiercely, then reached up and violently pulled the wooden projectile from his skin, severing it in two. He surprised the teen struggling to stand up by flashing upward. A former shinobi. A tiny blast blew out from the force of impact as the thug crashed to the ground behind the young boy. With his eyes widening, Inari spun around and began to reach for another arrow. He was too slow, though, as the former ninja's arm sprang out and a strong hand seized the child by the neck. With ease, he raised him off the ground, leaving his feet hanging pointlessly below. The boy with the raven hair kept his eyes firmly on the ground, but Inari felt the man's eyes burning into him intensely as he was hauled to eye level. The thug scowled, furious that he had dropped his defenses and been shot by a boy who was no older than 7. With his lungs burning for air, Inari gasped as his hand tightened around the boy's neck. The giant one was around the boy's neck, and his hands flew to it, tugging in vain at his hold. Lack of oxygen caused Inari's head to buzz and his vision to start swimming. He wanted nothing more than to sleep deeply and for a long time because his limbs felt heavier than usual. Naruto watched as the man's hands lost their strained hold on Inari as she sagged in them. A familiar wave of power smashed into his subconscious, bribing him to accept it, and he felt anger welling up in the pit of his stomach. He forced the intent to return to the unknown, even though his eyes flashed crimson red. Although it still adhered to him, he did accept a brief surge of energy that allowed him to tear the blade from the ground. The man was startled away from the boy as he slammed into his side after leaping across the clearing in a blur. As the man skidded away, landing far from the two, Inari was dropped to the ground, freed from the thug's hold. With a sickening sucking sound, Naruto ripped the knife from his arm and let out a guttural growl. He threw the weapon to the ground, and it fell away, the metal clattering on the cement. As the young child gasped for air, Naruto fell to his knees and pushed Inari onto his hands. The boy heaved dryly, shivering at the thought that he might have been killed there, and the blonde put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. For once, the kid with the raven hair looked up at the Konoha shinobi next to him, his charcoal eyes glimmering with awe rather than anger or indifference. When the thug began strangling Naruto, he was a long way away and, to make matters worse, pinned to the ground. Kakashi. Sensei was correct when he said that Naruto was strong, but he had been by his side in a split second. As he watched the former shinobi pull himself off the ground, the ninja asked, "Are you okay, Inari? Did he hurt you too bad?" The thug returned the ninja's blazing glare. With anger etched on his face, the big man sprang into a sprint from his crouch. Naruto felt a surge of chakra that had not previously existed as he pumped it all into the impending blow as he extended his fist. A blow like that would kill or seriously hurt whoever was able to block it, so Naruto clenched his teeth. Inari was still panting on the ground when the blonde stepped in front of her. It felt good when that recognizable surge of chakra erupted from his reserves as he flashed through a string of seals and realized that this was the first time he had used a jutsu in a while. Fuden. Daitopa. He yelled as he lifted his hands and brought them together in a powerful clap. His hands came together in the middle, and a blast of wind shot out in a blur at the man who was running, stopping him in his tracks and tearing at his skin while pushing his hair back wildly. He struggled against the strong winds and managed to hold his ground for a few seconds before his feet suddenly slipped out from under him and he was swept away, flying head over heels. When Naruto separated his hands, the winds ceased, and the loud whistling subsided into quiet. Inari's eyes moved from where the man had been a few seconds earlier to the blonde who was standing guard in front of him, looking judgingly into the clear mist in front of him as he searched the area for his opponent. Inari felt the force of strong winds attempting to drag him into the line of fire due to Naruto's powerful wind blast. How powerful was this guy? Now he was wondering the same thing. Naruto reluctantly turned away from the location where he had last seen the thug and muttered, "I think that did it." His cerulean eyes were blazing with worry and rage as he knelt beside Inari, asking, "Are you okay?" With a slight smile, Inari nodded his head. Naruto returned the smirk, but his nearly cheerful expression vanished when he saw the big, bluish, purple stain on Inari's neck. To get a better look at the bruise, he reached out and gently tipped the boy's chin to the left. His eyes immediately filled with anger, and he muttered a growl. He gritted his teeth, spat, and looked over his shoulder toward the direction the man should have landed. "Look at what he did to you." He released his tender grip on Inari's face and took a deep breath, controlling the uncontrollable rage he was experiencing. "He is only a child. If that idiot has the audacity to appear once more, I will." To get Naruto to stop brooding, Inari pulled on his sleeve. He looked intently at Naruto and asked, "Where's Grandpa, Naruto?" When Naruto remembered why they were here, the bridge builder, his heart skipped a beat. Since Haku had been killed, he had not seen him, and at this point, he was unsure of his survival. However, Naruto couldn't simply inform the child that his grandfather might not be alive. The blonde eventually answered, "He's with Sakura right now, I think." However, he wasn't entirely optimistic about the situation. He could hear the sounds of the huge fight going on in the distance, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had made it this far. Inari's expression brightened with relief, and his eyes became more relaxed. Naruto experienced regret right away. What if he was mistaken? In a quick flashback, he recalled how he had repeatedly seen the young child glaring at him while always maintaining an affectionate and adoring gaze for his grandfather. He was very close to his grandfather, particularly after the death of his father. In a flash, Naruto shocked the young child by yanking Inari onto his back as his eyes hardened with resolve. The blonde started running and ran back toward the sounds of combat. At all costs, he was determined to save these two. Sakura. Things weren't going well. It appeared that whoever they plowed down would be replaced by two more, even though they had been fighting with full force, eliminating many of the men at once. Even though they were losing strength, Gado's henchmen kept coming. She had observed that, with the exception of Naruto, everyone was still present. A short while ago, a rather large man had attacked him, and the two of them vanished into the mist. Since then, neither had submerged. She had begun to become concerned because Naruto was still seriously injured and she could tell from a cursory examination that he wasn't your typical villager. Sakura kicked the dagger out of the attacker's hand after avoiding another blow to her neck and flipping into a backward handspring. With a soft landing, she lunged forward and struck the man's midsection, knocking the wind from his lungs and sending him reeling backward. Sakura backed away with a satisfied smile, her eyes darting to the bridge builder who was never far away. His exposed skin was adorned with a few lines of blood from the few blows he had received here and there. She could see that his movements were becoming more sluggish due to his advanced age and lack of fighting experience, even though he was carrying a heavy and rather long piece of wood and using it to bat at anyone he could. Sakura stopped fighting, inhaled deeply, and then lunged back in, jarring a man away with a punch to the cheekbone. "We require a miracle." Abruptly, something brushed her back and she heard someone skid to a stop behind her. She spun around on her heel, prepared to defend herself, but was taken aback to see Naruto standing facing away from her, deflecting a series of slams thrown at him by a lanky gangster. The child on his back, however, was what startled her the most. She exclaimed, "Inari!" And the boy with the raven hair turned as far around as he could, giving the pinkhead a gentle smile that only a young child could give. Before Naruto leapt back and moved a few feet away from the kunoichi, he said, "Hello Sakura-san." Naruto's eyes strayed to the bewildered and amazed teenager before dancing back to her side. He cast a quick glance around, his blue eyes looking around. "Where's Tazuna?" he asked, deflecting a short, burly man's awkward kick into the cement. Sakura's gaze flickered back to Inari before settling back on Naruto's curious expression. She smiled slightly and replied, "He's over by Kakashi, fighting it out with a very big piece of oak." The blonde's eyebrow went up. "He's actually doing pretty well on his own." Inari curled into the teenager's neck, his eyes screwing shut as Naruto nodded and ducked to avoid a small knife stab. Sakura nervously bit her lip. What the devil was he doing here? This was no place for him. The shinobi asked, raising his defenses to prevent any shots from pasting him, "How about Sasuke?" Sakura scowled. She saw that he was shielding the young child by holding him to his back, but that didn't justify his lack of effort to get him out of here. She responded with a question of her own. "He's fine, but a more important question, why is Inari on your back?" A faint ghost of a smile appeared on Naruto's face as he grinned. With a faint chuckle, he said, Something more important than Sasuke. This is a big moment in history." Sakura frowned, emotion obscuring her dazzling emerald eyes. She responded, "Oh, shut it. Now answer my question," as Inari giggled at the blonde's remark, causing a flush to appear on her face. Naruto grinned once more, a little wider this time. "Well, I'm not quite sure myself to be honest," Sakura's forehead furrowed. "But, he came here armed with a crossbow and arrows, so I assume he's here to fight." He then responded. Sakura's gaze expanded. "Well, this is no place for him. We're not even supposed to technically be here," she murmured. Naruto let out a sigh. "We all agreed to keep on with the mission, even after the true level was revealed. Though by now, if my analysis is correct, I do believe this is bordering in a rank, maybe higher." Sakura gasped, momentarily losing sight of the fact that they were engaged in a fierce battle. "This isn't good. We're way out of our league," she cried. Instead of responding right away, Naruto clenched his teeth and swung his fist, slamming it past Sakura's head and slamming an opponent in the face. As the sniper collapsed, unconscious, Sakura retreated to her teammate. Naruto yelled, "Geez, would you please keep your head in the game? I can't watch both you and Inari," and swiftly swiped a man off his feet. Sakura's face was hot, she was furious and utterly embarrassed. "I don't need you to protect me, you know. I'm a Kunoichi of Konoha and therefore, can take care of myself. I have the ability to fight, that's why I'm a ninja," she responded with rage. Naruto gave a snort. "Prove it first, then maybe we'll talk." Sakura's heart smashed into her stomach as she froze. Anger, sadness, shock, disbelief, and hurt were all immediately present in her mind. Since meeting Naruto, she had never heard him say anything somewhat hurtful, especially not to her. As he looked over, wondering what was wrong, Naruto saw that the girl next to him had completely locked up. He saw the expression in her jade eyes at that moment. He saw many things swimming in her green eyes, but pain was the one that caught his attention the most. When he realized that he was the one responsible, his heart tightened. A wave of crushing guilt hit him immediately, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. They felt as though they were the only two people on the bridge, despite the fact that there were throngs of people fighting all around them. "Sakura, I..." A voice that the two recognized as Kakashi's interrupted, saying, "Naruto. Sakura, get over here now." After exchanging a quick glance, the two quickly ran in the direction of his voice, interrupting their conversation. With their backs to the center, the two joined Kakashi, Sasuke, and Tazuna, who were all huddled in a close circle. When Tazuna turned to face the newcomers, his eyes widened in fear and panic. He yelled, "Inari, what are you doing here?" Kakashi and Sasuke were now paying attention to the matter at hand. The young child on Naruto's back hid from his grandfather by shrinking into the shinobi's back. With a heavy sigh, Naruto stepped into the other's protective circle. Naruto smiled softly at the boy on his back and explained, "He appeared a few minutes ago, brandishing a crossbow. I think he came to join our little fight. And if he hadn't, I probably wouldn't be here right now." Behind his mask, Kakashi grinned, but it vanished as one of the braver men ran out at them, directly aiming for Sakura. She hit the man with a quick, seemingly powerful blow to the shoulder, striking a pressure point, so he didn't need to pay any attention to her warning. She moved between Sasuke and Kakashi, backing up into the tiny, pathetic group of people. What had made her so angry, the gray-haired man asked, raising an eyebrow. However, the others wouldn't be far behind if a few were already beginning to approach. He looked first at his clients, then at his students, because he couldn't and wouldn't allow them to perish here. He pulled a kunai from his holster and said, Sasuke, Naruto, Sakura, listen up. I want you three to escort Tazuna and Inari back home. Protect them in tsunami and don't leave the house no matter what. After exchanging a single look, the three genin realized that the vote was unanimous. Surprisingly, though, Naruto was the first to speak. The other two teenagers nodded in agreement as he responded, "No way in hell, Kakashi. Sensei, we're sticking right here." Naruto tilted his head in bewilderment as Kakashi grinned. "What?" he muttered, a tiny smile slowly appearing on his face. "You just called me sensei." He couldn't remember ever having Naruto call him sensei without a hint of sarcasm in his voice. Let him be the one to point that out. The blonde simply rolled his eyes in response. "This is dangerous though, guys, and you're so young." Sakura added quietly, the rage far away in her eyes, "It doesn't matter to us, Kakashi. Sensei, we're not leaving your side, no matter what happens." He knew he liked these guys, so Kakashi grinned. However, one issue remained. "But what about Tazuna and Inari? It's not safe for them to travel home alone," reminded Kakashi. Though they detested it, he was correct, and the three genin fell silent. Tazuna shook his head defiantly, his face hardening. "I won't be leaving. I'm tired of the treatment this town and all its good people have gone through for Gado's twisted beliefs. I will fight for this port's freedom, and I'll go out swinging." He made it clear that he would not be leaving. Inari gave an angry nod of agreement. The young child added, his charcoal eyes blazing with resolve, "Me too. Everyone else has done and risked so much to save us. It's about time that I lend hand." Tazuna grinned to himself. He was starting to resemble his father. On the outside, however, only concern could emerge. The old man's gaze shifted to the thronging crowds and then back to his grandson. He had come to terms with the possibility that he might not survive, but with Inari present, everything was different. When Naruto saw the intense worry and anxiety shining in their client's eyes, he leaned in to speak to him in a low voice. He tried his best not to be heard by his teammates as he muttered under his breath, "Tazuna-san. I swear to you that I will protect Inari at all costs, until the day I die." Tazuna's eyes glowed with appreciation and love as he grinned broadly. He understood the blonde's lack of concealment and simply nodded his gratitude in return. Kakashi, however, was a skilled listener. Additionally, it caused the masked shinobi to smile wider than Konoha. In the line of Gado's lackeys, one of the bigger men moved forward, his storm, gray eyes narrowing. He yelled, "Enough talk, we will destroy you in vengeance for Lord Gado," and the men supporting him responded with a string of war cries. Sakura brought her kunai up into a defensive position and swallowed hoarsely. With his hands already forming the first seal of his trademark fire jutsu, Sasuke slipped into a low stance. When necessary, Kakashi could flick his hand up from his headband to reveal his Sharingan. With a mixture of fear and courage in his eyes, Inari reloaded his crossbow, determined to not give up, not now, not ever. With both hands close to the center, Tazuna heaved his big post of wood onto his shoulder, prepared to fight as long as his bones would hold. Then, in the dim sunlight, Naruto silently pulled his blade from its sheath, its soft gray metal gleaming. He sighed. Itachi would be furious if he realized his behavior, but he had promised something.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.